Hi everyone, I know you are watching this content to accompany your sleep. So before we start, I want to know where you are watching from and what time you are watching. Also, don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe. Let's jump straight into the story. Story 1. Zeb Quinn finished his shift at Walmart in Asheville, North Carolina, on January 2nd, 2000. He had plans that evening to look at a car with his co-worker, Robert Jason Owens. After work, they met in the parking lot and left in separate vehicles. Surveillance cameras captured them at a gas station around 9:15 p.m., buying drinks. Shortly after leaving the station, Quinn signaled Owens to pull over. He had received a page and needed to return the call. After using a payphone, Quinn appeared shaken. He told Owens he had to cancel their plans and drove off abruptly, accidentally hitting Owens's vehicle before disappearing into the night. When Quinn failed to show up for work the next day, his mother, Denise Vlahakis, became concerned. She filed a missing persons report. 2 days later, a man called Walmart, claiming to be Quinn, saying he was sick. Investigators traced the call to a Volvo plant where Owens worked. When questioned, Owens admitted to making the call, but said Quinn had asked him to do so. Days later, Quinn's Mazda protege turned up in a restaurant parking lot in Asheville. Its headlights were on, and inside was a small, frightened puppy. Drawn on the rear windshield in pink lipstick were a pair of lips and an exclamation mark. Quinn's wallet and credit cards were missing. Investigators discovered that Quinn had recently been spending time with Misty Taylor, a young woman in a relationship with another man, Wesley Smith. Quinn had told friends that Smith disapproved and had threatened him. Taylor and Smith denied involvement. Phone records traced the page Quinn received on the night he vanished. It had come from the home of his aunt, Ina Ustic. She claimed she had not sent the page and was out with friends that evening, including Misty Taylor and Wesley Smith. That same night, her home was broken into. The mystery surrounding Quinn's disappearance deepened, and over the years, it became one of Asheville's most haunting unsolved cases. Weeks turned into months with no sign of Zeb Quinn. Investigators combed through every lead, but the case remained frustratingly cold. The unusual details surrounding his disappearance raised more questions than answers. The abandoned car, the puppy inside, the cryptic lipstick message, all pointed to something deeply personal, but nothing seemed to connect in a way that led to Quinn's whereabouts. His family held out hope, but as time passed, the reality of his vanishing set in. Authorities kept a close eye on Robert Jason Owens, the last person known to have seen Quinn. Owens's account of the night raised suspicion, but there was no concrete evidence linking him to foul play. He claimed that after Quinn sped off from their roadside stop, he continued toward Leicester as planned. Later that evening, Owens showed up at work with injuries, scratches on his arms, a bruised forehead. He told co-workers he had been in a car accident. However, there were no records of a crash matching his description. Investigators suspected the injuries could have been the result of an altercation, but without a body or witness testimony, they had nothing substantial to hold him. Attention soon turned back to the page Quinn had received that night. Why would someone at his aunt's house send him a message? Ina Ustic, Quinn's aunt, was insistent that she had no part in it. She had been out for dinner with friends when the message was sent. Among those at the dinner table were Misty Taylor and Wesley Smith. Quinn had told people that Smith was angry about his involvement with Taylor. Was this a coincidence, or was Smith trying to warn him? Ustic reported that when she returned home later that evening, her house had been broken into. No valuables were taken, but drawers were ransacked, papers scattered. It was as if someone had been looking for something specific. Despite these leads, the case continued to stall. No evidence surfaced to confirm whether Quinn had met with foul play or had disappeared willingly. His bank accounts remained untouched. His family insisted he had no reason to run away. The restaurant where his car was found was not a place he frequented. If someone had planted his car there, why that location? The puppy inside was another enigma. Quinn had no known connection to the animal, and no one came forward to claim it. The pressure to find answers weighed heavily on detectives. They re-examined surveillance footage from the night Quinn disappeared. The video from the gas station showed Quinn and Owens buying drinks, nothing unusual. But after Quinn left in a hurry, there were no further sightings. His car didn't show up on other traffic cameras. It was as if he had simply vanished into thin air. As the years passed, the case became one of Asheville's most well-known mysteries. Rumors spread throughout the community. Some believed Quinn had gotten involved in something dangerous, something he never spoke about. Others were convinced someone close to him knew more than they were admitting. His family refused to give up, hoping for a breakthrough. But without a body, without a crime scene, the truth remained buried. Years passed, and Zeb Quinn's case remained an open wound in Asheville. His family never stopped searching for answers, but with no new evidence, the case grew cold. Detectives revisited the few leads they had, hoping for a breakthrough. They re-interviewed Robert Jason Owens multiple times, but his story remained unchanged. There were still inconsistencies: his injuries the night Quinn disappeared, the strange phone call to Walmart, and his vague timeline, but nothing that could be proven as criminal involvement. Without a body or any physical evidence tying Owens to a crime, authorities had little to go on. Quinn's mother, Denise Vlahakis, remained vocal about her son's disappearance. She pushed for renewed investigations and pleaded for the public's help. Every few years, new theories would emerge. Some believed Quinn had been murdered over his interest in Misty Taylor, that her boyfriend Wesley Smith had orchestrated an attack to eliminate his romantic rival. Others thought Quinn had uncovered something dangerous, possibly involving someone he knew. The mysterious break-in at his aunt's house on the night of his disappearance only added to the speculation. Then, in 2015, a shocking event shattered the quiet stagnation of the case. Robert Jason Owens, the last person to see Zeb Quinn, was arrested for an entirely different crime. He was charged with the brutal murders of Christy Schoen Codd and her husband, J.T. Codd, a well-known couple in the area. Investigators found that Owens had not only killed them, but had also attempted to destroy their remains. The nature of the crime was chillingly methodical. Authorities were horrified by the level of violence, and the arrest immediately brought renewed attention to Quinn's case. If Owens was capable of such brutality, could he have done the same to Quinn? With Owens now in custody, investigators pressed him about Quinn. They hoped he would finally reveal what had happened on that January night in 2000. For years, he had denied any involvement, but with mounting pressure, cracks began to form in his story. In 2017, he finally confessed, at least partially. Owens admitted that he had helped dispose of Quinn's body. According to his statement, his uncle, Gene Owens, was the one who had actually killed Quinn. The motive, he claimed, was a murder-for-hire plot ordered by Wesley Smith, Misty Taylor's boyfriend at the time. Owens said Smith had wanted Quinn dead because of his growing relationship with Taylor, and Gene Owens had been paid to carry it out. Once the murder was complete, Owens claimed he had assisted in covering it up, but there were still unanswered questions. Gene Owens had died in 2017, taking any further details with him. The confession also lacked a key element: Quinn's body. Despite Owens's admission, investigators were unable to recover any remains. Without physical evidence, the case could not be fully closed. Owens took a plea deal, admitting to being an accessory after the fact, but he was never convicted of Quinn's murder itself. For Quinn's family, the confession brought mixed emotions. It confirmed their worst fears: Zeb had been murdered, but without a body, there was no true closure. The unanswered questions continued to haunt them. Was Owens telling the full truth, or was he protecting himself from more serious charges? Had Wesley Smith really ordered the killing, or was there another motive no one had uncovered? Decades after that fateful night, the mystery of Zeb Quinn remains. His name still lingers in Asheville's collective memory, a reminder of a young man taken too soon. His family continues to seek justice, refusing to let the case fade into obscurity. Even with Owens's confession, the full truth remains elusive, locked away with those who know what really happened. The case stands as one of North Carolina's most unsettling disappearances, one that, despite the years, refuses to be forgotten. Story 2. On January 19, 2000, the tranquil neighborhood of Pasir Ris in Singapore was shaken by a tragic event that would become one of the nation's most notorious criminal cases. The lifeless body of 17-year-old Ko Mu Chin was discovered in a flat at Block 562, Pasir Ris Street 51. The subsequent investigation revealed a harrowing tale of love, jealousy, and betrayal that culminated in murder. Ko Mu Chin, affectionately known as Mu Chin, was a student at a local polytechnic. Described by friends and family as cheerful and kind-hearted, she was in a relationship with 18-year-old Chan Chun Wai. Chan, a part-time waiter, was known to be deeply infatuated with Mu Chin. However, their relationship was fraught with challenges, primarily stemming from Chan's intense jealousy and possessiveness. Mu Chin and Chan had been dating for several months. Friends noted that while Mu Chin appeared happy, there were underlying tensions. Chan's possessive nature often led to disagreements, especially when Mu Chin interacted with other male friends. Despite these issues, the couple continued their relationship, with Chan frequently expressing his deep affection for Mu Chin. In late 1999, Mu Chin became acquainted with another young man, whose identity was not widely publicized. This new friendship did not sit well with Chan. He became increasingly suspicious and paranoid, fearing that Mu Chin was developing romantic feelings for this individual. Chan's jealousy intensified, leading to frequent arguments between the couple. On January 19, 2000, Chan invited Mu Chin to his flat in Pasir Ris. According to Chan's later statements, the two spent the day together, during which they engaged in intimate relations. Following this, a conversation ensued where Mu Chin allegedly confessed that she had stronger feelings for the other man. This revelation devastated Chan, overcome with a mix of heartbreak and rage. He confronted Mu Chin about her feelings. The situation escalated rapidly. In a fit of jealousy and despair, Chan strangled Mu Chin, leading to her untimely death. Realizing the gravity of his actions, Chan attempted to end his own life by slashing his wrists. However, his suicide attempt was unsuccessful. He then spent the night beside Mu Chin's lifeless body, grappling with the reality of what he had done. The following day, Chan's mother returned home to find her son injured and Mu Chin dead. She immediately alerted the authorities. Chan was arrested and taken into custody. During police interrogations, he confessed to the murder, citing his overwhelming jealousy and fear of losing Mu Chin as the primary motives behind his actions. Chan Chun-wai was charged with the murder of Ko Mu Chin. During the trial, the prosecution presented evidence of Chan's possessiveness and his inability to cope with the perceived threat to his relationship. The defense, on the other hand, highlighted Chan's youth and emotional turmoil, arguing that the act was not premeditated, but rather a spontaneous reaction to emotional distress. Despite the defense's arguments, the court found Chan guilty of murder. Given the severity of the crime and the circumstances surrounding it, Chan was sentenced to death. The case garnered significant media attention, leading to widespread discussions about youth relationships, emotional health, and the consequences of unchecked jealousy. The tragic death of Ko Mu Chin served as a somber reminder of the potential dangers of possessiveness and uncontrolled emotions in relationships. It prompted educational institutions and community organizations in Singapore to initiate programs focusing on healthy relationship dynamics, emotional regulation, and conflict resolution among youths. The case also highlighted the importance of mental health awareness, emphasizing the need for accessible counseling services for young individuals dealing with emotional and relational challenges. The memory of Mu Chin's untimely death continues to resonate in Singapore, underscoring the critical importance of addressing emotional well-being in the nation's youth. The news of Ko Mu Chin's tragic death spread rapidly, shocking the local community and leaving her family in deep grief. She had been a bright student with a promising future, but that future had been violently stolen away. Her parents, unable to comprehend the brutal manner in which their daughter had died, pleaded for justice. The authorities immediately launched a full-scale investigation, combing through every detail of the crime scene and piecing together the sequence of events leading to her death. Chan Chun-wai, now in police custody, remained in a state of shock. He was treated for his self-inflicted wounds before being transferred to an interrogation room. Detectives pressed him for details, but in the initial hours, he struggled to speak coherently. His emotions fluctuated between deep regret and anger. He admitted to killing Mu Chin, but insisted that it had not been planned. He claimed that he had acted in a moment of uncontrollable despair when she confessed her feelings for another man. His tears and remorseful demeanor suggested that he had not intended for things to end this way. But the law was clear. Intentional or not, he had taken a life. Investigators carefully reconstructed the timeline. On the morning of January 19th, Chan had messaged Mu Chin, inviting her over. She had hesitated at first, knowing that their relationship had been rocky in recent weeks, but she eventually agreed. She arrived at his flat around noon, and neighbors later reported hearing faint sounds of conversation and laughter coming from inside. The two had spent the afternoon together, talking, eating, and, as Chan later admitted, being physically intimate. However, tensions began to rise when Chan pressed her about her feelings. He demanded to know if she still loved him, or if she had developed feelings for someone else. Mu Chin, never one to lie, told him the truth. She had started to see someone else as more than a friend. The revelation was like a dagger to Chan's heart. He had been deeply in love with Mu Chin, believing that their relationship was unbreakable despite their recent arguments. The idea of her choosing another man over him sent him into a spiral of jealousy and rage. Witnesses would later recall that at some point in the afternoon, loud noises were heard from Chan's apartment. Objects being knocked over, raised voices, and then sudden silence. Chan later described what happened next in his confession. Overcome by emotion, he grabbed Mu Chin by the shoulders, shaking her as he pleaded with her to take back what she had said. She tried to push him away, telling him that it was over, that she didn't want to fight anymore. But Chan refused to let go. His hands moved from her shoulders to her neck, squeezing tightly in desperation. What started as an act of pleading quickly escalated into something far more dangerous. As his grip tightened, Mu Chin struggled, her nails clawing at his hands, trying to pull him off. But Chan, blinded by rage, did not stop. When he finally let go, she collapsed onto the floor, motionless. It was only then that he realized the horrifying truth. He had killed her. Panic set in. He dropped to his knees, shaking her, calling her name, hoping that she would wake up. But her body remained still, her face drained of life. He checked for a pulse, but there was none. He backed away in shock, his mind racing with what to do next. He thought of calling the police, but feared what would happen to him. He considered running, disappearing, but where would he go? He could already see his future unraveling before him. Arrest, trial, prison, or worse, the death penalty. The weight of his actions crushed him, and in a moment of despair, he took a knife from the kitchen and slashed his own wrists, hoping to end his life. But the cuts were shallow, the pain unbearable, and his fear of death overtook his guilt. He bandaged his wounds, sat on the floor beside Mu Chin's body, and stayed there all night, unable to move, unable to think, drowning in his own horror. It was not until the next morning that the crime was discovered. Chan's mother, who had been away for the night, returned home to find the door unlocked. As she stepped inside, she was immediately struck by the eerie silence. She called out for her son, but there was no response. Moving further into the apartment, she found Chan sitting in the corner of the living room, staring blankly at the wall, his bandaged wrists resting limply on his lap. Then she saw the body. She let out a scream that echoed through the entire building, alerting neighbors, who rushed to see what had happened. The police arrived within minutes. Officers found Chan unresponsive, barely reacting as they handcuffed him and took him away. Mu Chin's body was carefully examined, and the cause of death was confirmed: manual strangulation. There were bruises around her neck and defensive wounds on her hands, indicating that she had fought back. Investigators also found shattered objects on the floor, signs of a struggle that had turned deadly. Bloodstains from Chan's self-inflicted wounds were smeared across the walls, adding to the grim scene. The medical examiner estimated that Mu Chin had died within minutes of being strangled, meaning that Chan had spent the entire night in the same room as her lifeless body. The eerie detail disturbed many, painting a picture of a young man trapped in his own nightmare, unable to face the consequences of what he had done. News of the murder spread quickly across Singapore. Media outlets covered the case extensively, analyzing every aspect of the relationship, the crime, and the psychological state of the accused. People were horrified that a love story had ended in such a brutal and senseless way. Many debated whether Chan had truly lost control in a fit of passion, or if there had been underlying signs of violence long before the murder. Some believed that his obsessive jealousy had been a warning sign that was ignored, while others felt pity for a young man whose emotions had spiraled into something he could no longer control. Mu Chin's family was devastated. Her parents, overwhelmed by grief, struggled to understand how their daughter had fallen victim to such a terrible fate. They spoke about how full of life she had been, how she had dreams of traveling, of building a career, of experiencing the world. All of it had been stolen from her in an instant. Her friends mourned the loss of a kind, bright girl who had so much ahead of her. Many found it difficult to reconcile the image of Chan, whom they had known as quiet and devoted, with that of a murderer. With the crime scene processed and the suspect in custody, the focus shifted to the legal proceedings. Chan was charged with murder, and prosecutors prepared to present their case. They had a confession, physical evidence, and a clear motive. But despite the overwhelming evidence, questions remained. Was this a crime of passion, or had it been premeditated? Could Chan's mental state at the time of the murder influence the court's decision? As the trial loomed, the case gripped the entire nation, leaving people anxiously waiting to see how justice would be served. The trial of Chan Chun Wai began amid intense media scrutiny, with the entire nation closely following the proceedings. The courtroom was packed with reporters, legal experts, and members of the public, all eager to witness how justice would unfold. Mu Chin's grieving parents sat in the front row, their faces etched with pain and exhaustion, while Chan's family sat silently behind him, struggling to reconcile the young man they had raised with the accused standing before the judge. The prosecution and defense teams prepared to present their arguments, knowing that the outcome of this case would not only determine Chan's fate, but also send a strong message about domestic violence, possessiveness, and the limits of emotional control in relationships. The prosecution wasted no time in laying out its case. The lead prosecutor described Chan's jealousy, his escalating possessiveness, and his refusal to accept that Mu Chin was moving on. They painted a picture of a young man obsessed with control, one who could not handle rejection, and had ultimately chosen to kill rather than let go. The evidence was damning. Mu Chin's injuries clearly indicated a struggle, suggesting that she had fought for her life in her final moments. The bruising on her neck was consistent with prolonged strangulation, not a momentary loss of control, but a deliberate act of force that lasted long enough to ensure she would not survive. The prosecution emphasized that this was not an accident, not a momentary lapse in judgment, but a conscious choice to end another human life. The defense, on the other hand, argued that Chan had acted in the heat of the moment. They described him as an emotionally unstable young man, overwhelmed by heartbreak and desperation. They presented psychological evaluations suggesting that Chan suffered from severe emotional distress and had been pushed to the edge by the fear of losing Mu Chin. They highlighted his attempted suicide, arguing that it demonstrated remorse rather than a calculated attempt to escape justice. The defense claimed that Chan had never intended to kill, that he had simply lost control during an emotionally charged confrontation. They pleaded for leniency, suggesting that he was not a cold-blooded murderer, but a deeply troubled individual who had made a terrible mistake. Witness testimonies played a crucial role in shaping the narrative. Friends of Mu Chin recounted how she had expressed concerns about Chan's behavior in the weeks leading up to the murder. She had told close friends that Chan had become more possessive, constantly questioning her whereabouts and growing increasingly suspicious of her interactions with other men. She had mentioned wanting to end the relationship, but had hesitated, fearing how he would react. These testimonies reinforced the prosecution's claim that Chan's jealousy had been building for some time, and that the murder was the tragic culmination of a toxic relationship. Chan's own friends and family painted a different picture. They described him as a quiet, affectionate young man who had always been devoted to Mu Chin. They acknowledged that he had struggled with jealousy, but insisted that he had never been violent before. They expressed shock and disbelief that he could have committed such a heinous act, suggesting that he must have been pushed to an emotional breaking point. Forensic experts took the stand to explain the details of the crime scene. They confirmed that Mu Chin had died from asphyxiation caused by sustained pressure on her neck. The marks on her skin indicated that Chan had used his hands rather than an object, meaning that he had felt her life slipping away under his grip and had still chosen not to let go. The experts explained that strangulation was a slow, intimate form of killing, one that required conscious effort over an extended period. This testimony directly contradicted the defense's claim that the murder had been an unintentional act of passion. The trial continued for weeks, with both sides fiercely debating whether Chan's actions constituted premeditated murder or a crime of passion. The judge listened carefully, weighing the evidence and the emotional testimonies presented by both families. The prosecution pushed for the harshest penalty possible, arguing that the brutal nature of the crime demanded justice. The defense pleaded for a lighter sentence, asking the court to consider Chan's youth and emotional state at the time of the crime. As the trial neared its conclusion, the weight of the case became increasingly unbearable for everyone involved. Mu Chin's parents sat through each session, forced to relive their daughter's final moments over and over again. They struggled to contain their grief as they listened to descriptions of how she had fought for her life, how she had gasped for breath, how she had tried desperately to escape the hands of someone she had once trusted. Their pain was immeasurable, but their resolve remained strong. They wanted justice for their daughter, and they wanted the court to recognize that her life had been stolen by someone who had no right to take it. Chan himself remained mostly silent throughout the trial, his expressions ranging from remorse to emptiness. He appeared to be a broken man, fully aware of what he had done and the consequences that awaited him. At times, he seemed lost in his own thoughts, unable to meet the eyes of Mu Chin's family. His lawyer advised him not to take the stand, knowing that any emotional outburst could work against him. Instead, the court relied on his recorded confession, in which he had admitted to the murder but insisted that it had not been planned. As the final arguments were made, the courtroom fell into a heavy silence. The judge would soon deliver the verdict, a decision that would determine whether Chan would spend the rest of his life in prison or face an even harsher punishment. The nation waited with bated breath, knowing that whatever the outcome, nothing could undo the tragedy that had already taken place. The case had sparked intense debates about possessiveness in relationships, the dangers of unchecked jealousy, and the fine line between love and obsession. It had become more than just a legal battle. It was a cautionary tale, a painful reminder of how emotions, when left unchecked, could lead to irreversible destruction. The final day of the trial approached, and the courtroom was more packed than ever. Reporters whispered among themselves, legal experts speculated on the possible outcomes, and the families braced themselves for what was to come. The air was thick with tension, the weight of the case pressing down on everyone present. The judge prepared to deliver the final ruling, and as the room fell silent, all eyes turned toward Chan Chun-wai, the young man whose life had forever changed the moment he chose to wrap his hands around the neck of the girl he claimed to love. The courtroom fell into an eerie stillness as the judge prepared to read the verdict. Every breath was held, every heartbeat seemed to echo against the cold walls. Mu Chin's parents clutched each other's hands, their faces pale and strained from weeks of emotional torment. Across the aisle, Chan Chun-wai sat rigid in his seat, his eyes fixed on the wooden bench before him, his fingers trembling slightly. The entire nation had followed the case, but now, it was time for justice to be delivered. The judge, his expression impassive, began by summarizing the evidence. He spoke of the overwhelming proof that Chan had not acted in self-defense or by accident, but in a deliberate act of violence driven by jealousy and control. The forensic reports, the witness testimonies, and Chan's own confession had made it clear. This was not a case of sudden rage, but a crime rooted in possessiveness. The judge acknowledged the defense's plea for leniency, recognizing Chan's young age and the emotional turmoil he had suffered. However, he also emphasized that taking another person's life, especially in such a cruel and intimate manner, could not be excused by mere passion or heartbreak. Chan's mother let out a quiet sob, muffling her cries behind her hand as the judge prepared to announce the sentence. Chan, who had been visibly tense throughout the trial, finally raised his eyes, his face a mixture of dread and resignation. He knew what was coming. The death of Mu Chin could not be undone, and the law of the land was clear. Murder was an unforgivable crime, one that carried the weight of the harshest punishment. The final words fell heavy in the air. Chan Chun-wai was sentenced to death. A collective gasp rippled through the courtroom, followed by the quiet murmurs of those trying to process the ruling. Mu Chin's mother broke into uncontrollable sobs, her body shaking with a mixture of grief and relief. Her husband wrapped his arms around her, holding her close as she wept for their daughter, for the life she had lost, for the justice that had finally been served. For them, it was a small measure of closure in a nightmare that would never truly end. Chan sat motionless for several seconds before lowering his head. He did not cry, did not protest, did not speak. The weight of the sentence pressed down on him, sealing his fate in a way that he had perhaps always known was inevitable. The officers moved toward him, preparing to escort him out, but he did not resist. There was no more struggle, no more defiance. Only silence. Outside the courthouse, the crowd erupted with mixed emotions. Some expressed satisfaction that justice had been served, believing that Chan deserved his punishment for the brutal act he had committed. Others, particularly those who had known him personally, were conflicted. He had been a boy, barely an adult, and yet his life was now over. The case had ignited national discussions about the dangers of possessiveness in relationships, the warning signs of emotional instability, and the irreversible consequences of allowing jealousy to turn into violence. Mu Chin's funeral was held a few days later, attended by hundreds of friends, family members, and community members who came to pay their final respects. Her coffin was adorned with white lilies, her framed photograph placed at the front of the service, capturing her youthful smile one last time. Eulogies were given, stories were shared, and tears were shed. But there were no words that could undo what had been done, no comfort that could truly ease the pain of losing a daughter, a sister, a friend to an act of senseless violence. Chan spent his final days in prison awaiting execution. He was placed in solitary confinement, given time to reflect on the crime that had sealed his fate. Reports from prison staff suggested that he remained mostly quiet, rarely speaking except when necessary. He neither begged for mercy nor tried to appeal his sentence. It was as if he had already accepted his destiny. Some believed he was consumed by regret, haunted by the memory of what he had done. Others speculated that he had simply given up, unable to envision a future beyond the prison walls. Months later, in the early hours of the morning, Chan Chun-wai was led to the gallows. His final moments were spent in quiet solitude, with only the faint sound of footsteps echoing against the cold stone floors. When asked if he had any last words, he hesitated for a long moment before finally speaking. His voice was soft, barely above a whisper, but his words carried the weight of his guilt. "I'm sorry," and then it was over. The case of Ko Mu-chin and Chan Chun-wai remained etched in the memories of those who had followed it. It was more than just a crime. It was a cautionary tale of love turned into obsession, of emotions left unchecked until they became something monstrous. Schools and organizations used the tragedy to educate young people on the importance of recognizing toxic relationships, of seeking help when emotions became overwhelming, of understanding that love was never meant to be possessive or violent. Mu-chin's family continued to grieve, but they also worked to ensure that her story would not be forgotten. They became advocates for relationship awareness programs, speaking at schools and events, hoping that by sharing their daughter's story, they could prevent another tragedy from happening. Their pain never truly faded, but they found solace in knowing that Mu-chin's memory lived on, not just as a victim, but as a reminder that love should never cost a life. Story 3. On January 4th, 2000, a horrific crime rocked the quiet suburban community of Penang, Malaysia. A middle-aged man, To Sui Lung, was found brutally murdered in his home under mysterious circumstances. The case would go on to capture national attention due to the shocking details surrounding his death and the investigation that followed. To Sui Lung was a successful businessman who had made his fortune in the local real estate market. He was known as a meticulous and private individual, often spending long hours working from his luxurious home. His family described him as a dedicated father and husband, although those who worked with him often spoke of his volatile temper and intense desire for control. His wife, Tan Mei Lee, was a quiet and reserved woman, known to keep to herself, while their 2 children were away at university during the time of the murder. On the morning of January 4th, To's housekeeper, Li Yen, arrived to find the front door wide open, a rare occurrence given the security measures in place at the home. She entered cautiously, calling out for To, but received no answer. As she made her way into the living room, she was struck by the scene before her. To Sui Lung's body lay sprawled on the floor in a pool of blood. His face was bruised and battered, and his throat had been slashed so deeply that the blood had soaked into the carpet beneath him. His body was surrounded by scattered furniture, suggesting a violent struggle had taken place. Li Yen immediately called the police, her voice trembling as she relayed the discovery to the authorities. Within minutes, officers arrived at the scene, securing the area and beginning their investigation. The initial examination revealed that To had suffered significant injuries, including multiple blows to the head and face, likely caused by blunt force trauma. His throat had been slit with a sharp object, almost certainly a knife. It appeared that the victim had been ambushed and attacked in the midst of his morning routine. There were no signs of forced entry into the house, suggesting that To's attacker may have been someone he knew, someone he trusted. Detective Wang Han was assigned to the case, a seasoned investigator known for his attention to detail and his ability to uncover hidden motives. He immediately began questioning those close to the victim, starting with the family. To's wife, Tan Mei Lee, was visibly shaken when the police arrived to inform her of her husband's death. She was in disbelief, insisting that she had no idea who would want to harm her husband. She claimed that the couple's relationship had been relatively peaceful, despite the occasional argument, but there had been no indication that anyone would wish him harm. Detective Wang listened carefully to her statements, but remained skeptical. There was something about Tan Mei Lee's demeanor that didn't quite match the shock of someone who had just lost her spouse. While she was clearly upset, her answers seemed rehearsed, almost too measured. The detective filed this away in his mind, but continued to investigate other potential leads. Next, Wang spoke to the housekeeper, Li Yen, who had worked for the To family for several years. Li Yen was visibly distressed, her eyes red from crying. She explained that she had been with the family for over 5 years, and had always been treated well. There was nothing out of the ordinary in the days leading up to the murder, although she mentioned that To had seemed particularly on edge recently. She had overheard him arguing on the phone with someone the day before his death, but she didn't know the details of the conversation. Detective Wong took note of this and asked Li Yan to provide a description of the phone call. She recalled To's voice rising in anger, his words muffled, but she was sure he had been yelling at someone, possibly a business associate. Li Yan had no idea who it was, but she remembered that To had been in a particularly bad mood after the call. Wong then questioned the family's financial situation. It was known that To had been involved in a number of risky real estate deals in the months leading up to his death. Several of his investments had recently faltered, leaving him with significant debts. His business dealings were often shrouded in secrecy, with few people truly understanding the full scope of his operations. Could his death have been the result of a financial dispute gone wrong? Detective Wong decided to visit To's office, where he hoped to uncover more information about his business dealings. To's secretary, Karen Lee, was devastated by the news of her employer's death. She explained that the last time she had spoken to him was the day before the murder, and he had seemed distracted and upset. He had mentioned a problem, but refused to go into detail. She recalled that To had spoken about an important meeting that was supposed to take place later in the week, but she wasn't sure who the meeting was with or what it was about. As Wong sifted through To's financial records, he uncovered troubling signs of financial instability. It appeared that To had been living beyond his means, borrowing large sums of money from various sources, including loan sharks. Several large transactions had been made to anonymous accounts, and there was evidence of pressure mounting from creditors. Wong considered the possibility that To's murder had been orchestrated by one of these individuals, someone seeking to recoup their losses through violence. However, there was no direct evidence linking anyone to the crime yet. The detective's next lead came from To's close associate, a man named Ko Ming-shung, who had been involved in many of his business ventures. Ko was a charismatic and ambitious man, known for his sharp business acumen, but also for his ruthlessness when it came to securing deals. Ko had been in close contact with To in the weeks leading up to the murder, and Wong began to suspect that their relationship might have been more than just professional. When Wong interviewed Ko, he was initially cooperative, though he seemed eager to downplay the intensity of his relationship with To. He explained that while they had worked together on several projects, their business relationship had recently soured. Ko admitted that To had begun questioning his loyalty and had accused him of taking advantage of their partnership. Ko denied any involvement in To's death, but Wong couldn't help but notice his discomfort under questioning. Ko's alibi was weak. He claimed to have been out of town on business at the time of the murder, but he was unable to provide substantial proof of his whereabouts. Wong decided to dig deeper into Ko's finances and connections, suspecting that he might have more to hide than he was letting on. As the investigation continued, Detective Wong began to uncover troubling details about Ko's background. He had been involved in a number of shady deals and had several run-ins with the law, though none had led to serious charges. Was Ko involved in illegal activities that To had discovered? Had Ko been driven to murder to silence his former partner before he could reveal any secrets? As the days passed, the pieces of the puzzle slowly began to come together. Detective Wong was determined to uncover the truth about who had killed To Sui Lung, and the investigation was far from over. The question remained, was the motive behind To's death one of financial gain, a personal betrayal, or something darker still? As the mystery deepened, one thing was certain. The man who had taken To's life was still out there, and Wong would stop at nothing to bring him to justice. Detective Wong's investigation continued to reveal more layers of complexity, particularly concerning To Sui Lung's business dealings. As the days passed, the pieces of the puzzle seemed to slowly fall into place, though the motive behind the crime remained elusive. Wong knew that in order to solve the case, he had to delve deeper into To's relationships, both personal and professional, examining every angle with unwavering focus. The first lead that caught Wong's attention was To's business partner, Ko Ming-shung. Despite his attempts to downplay their relationship, the more Wong dug into Ko's past, the more suspicious it became. Ko had been a central figure in many of To's real estate ventures, some of which had been highly profitable, but others had been disastrous. There were reports of shady dealings, substandard construction work, and customers who had been cheated out of their investments. Despite these setbacks, Ko's wealth seemed to be growing, and he had always been able to cover up his failures through clever manipulation of business contracts and his connections in high places. Wong's first instinct was that Ko might have been behind To's murder. The two men had argued fiercely in the weeks leading up to To's death. According to To's secretary, Karen Lee, the last conversation she had overheard between the two men was heated. To had accused Ko of using their partnership as a stepping stone to expand his own ventures while neglecting the risks involved. In return, Ko had become defensive, brushing off To's concerns and dismissing his accusations as paranoia. But what Wang found even more compelling was a conversation that took place just days before To's death. Ko had been seen entering To's office late in the evening, long after normal working hours, where they had spoken privately for nearly an hour. What could they have discussed in those final moments? Wang pondered. Was it a final negotiation over business affairs, or did something else transpire during that late-night conversation? It was clear that their professional relationship had become strained, and the possibility of financial gain as a motive for murder was certainly plausible. However, Wang needed more concrete evidence to tie Ko to the crime. Wang decided to follow up on Ko's alibi, one that had seemed flimsy from the start. Ko had claimed that he was in another city on business the night of To's murder, but his alibi was weak. He had provided no solid evidence of his whereabouts, and his business associates in the city could not confirm his presence. There were no flight records, no hotel bookings, and no witnesses who could verify his story. The detective could feel the weight of the lie hanging over Ko, and he pressed harder on the subject. Wang's breakthrough came when he discovered that Ko had recently taken out a large loan in his name, a loan that had been used to purchase several properties in the area. The loan had been arranged through an underground lender known for working with criminals and shady business deals. Wang had a hunch that the loan had been used to cover some of the debts Ko had accrued in his other ventures, but now it appeared that Ko had been leveraging his association with To to secure the loan. If To had discovered Ko's financial strain, it was possible that Ko saw him as a liability, someone who could expose his shady dealings and put his growing wealth at risk. The deeper Wang dug, the clearer it became that Ko had a lot to lose. A motive had finally emerged, but it wasn't enough to make an arrest. For now, Wang had to tread carefully, knowing that any misstep could lead to the wrong conclusions. He needed to find something more tangible. In the meantime, the investigation also turned to To's family life. Detective Wang had already spoken to Tan Mei-li, To's wife, but he had noticed several inconsistencies in her behavior. She had initially claimed to be unaware of any serious issues between her husband and Ko, but Wang suspected she was hiding something. Tan Mei-li's answers, though calm and collected, seemed rehearsed. She appeared to show no signs of true grief, which led Wang to believe that she might know more than she was letting on. Wang decided to focus on her and her relationship with To. The couple had been married for over 20 years, and outwardly, they appeared to have a stable, if not perfect, marriage. But family, friends, and acquaintances described a different picture, a picture of tension beneath the surface. Several people recalled seeing the couple engage in heated arguments, usually revolving around money and To's increasing workload. Some said Tan Mei-li had expressed concern over her husband's obsession with business, claiming that he had neglected their family life for years. Was it possible that the tension in their marriage had played a role in To's death? Wang decided to look into Tan Mei-li's financial situation. He discovered that, despite her husband's wealth, Tan Mei-li had recently opened a private bank account in her name and made large withdrawals in the months leading up to his murder. These transactions were unusually frequent, and Wang was curious about the nature of the withdrawals. It appeared as though she had been making significant payments to an unknown recipient. This discovery raised a troubling question. Could Tan Mei-li have had a hand in her husband's death? Had she been involved in a secret affair, or was she possibly trying to escape from her husband's control? As Wang continued to dig deeper into the financials, he stumbled upon another unsettling clue. Tan Mei-li had been in contact with a known figure in the local gambling underworld. This person, a man named Ah Sung, was involved in illegal loan sharking and money laundering operations. A few weeks before To's death, Tan Mei-li had visited Ah Sung in a discreet meeting. Though she claimed it was a casual meeting about a business transaction, the detective found it odd that a woman like her, married to a successful businessman, would have dealings with someone like Ah Sung. Was Tan Mei-li involved in some kind of financial or personal scheme that led to her husband's murder? Did she have a motive to rid herself of To, whether because of debt or because of an affair? Detective Wang was beginning to see multiple potential motives, each one more complicated than the last. Tan Mei-li's involvement, however subtle, was undeniable. But was she the mastermind behind the murder, or was she simply a pawn in a much larger game? At this point, Wang needed more concrete evidence to solidify his suspicions. while Ko Ming-shung's financial dealings and possible connections to the underground world pointed to a potential motive. Tan Mei Li's recent actions suggested that she might have had her own reasons for wanting To dead. It seemed that both were connected to the crime in ways that could not yet be fully explained. As Wang reflected on the case, he knew that the truth was tangled in a web of deceit, and it would take all his skill to unravel it. He had to piece together the puzzle from the pieces of a life that had been shattered. But with every new discovery, the layers of the crime seemed to grow deeper and more sinister. As Detective Wang continued to piece together the puzzle of To Sui Lung's murder, he began to feel the weight of the investigation pressing down on him. The case was no longer just about a business dispute gone wrong or a financial mishap. The deeper he dug, the more it seemed that the murder was intricately tied to greed, betrayal, and long-held secrets. Every lead, every piece of evidence raised more questions than answers. The next breakthrough came when Wang turned his attention to the forensic evidence. While the initial investigation had focused on the possibility of a financial motive, the forensic report revealed something new. A set of fingerprints found on the murder weapon. The knife used to slit To's throat had been carefully cleaned, but not thoroughly enough. Traces of blood remained on the handle, and forensic experts were able to lift partial prints from it. The prints were too smudged to be a perfect match, but they were enough to narrow the suspects down. The fingerprints did not belong to Ko Ming-shung, To's business partner, nor did they belong to Tan Mei Li, To's wife. But they did match another person, Sung, the notorious figure in the local gambling world, who had been connected to Tan Mei Li through their financial dealings. This revelation sent a shockwave through Wang's investigation. Sung had a long history of criminal activity, including loan sharking, extortion, and illegal gambling. He had numerous connections to people who would go to great lengths to settle debts, people who could easily resort to violence. What was the link between Sung and To? Wang knew that this would be the key to unlocking the mystery. While it had seemed at first like a simple case of business partners in conflict, this new evidence suggested a much more complicated relationship, one that involved criminal underworld ties, money, and possibly blackmail. Wang's next step was to dig into Sung's activities. He spent several days reviewing his criminal history and connections, trying to find a link between him and To. It didn't take long for Wang to uncover an unsettling connection. A few months before To's murder, he had sought out a loan from a local lender, a loan that had been arranged through Sung's connections. Initially, To had denied needing the money, but records showed that he had made several large payments to an anonymous account just before his death. It seemed that the loans he had taken out from the gambling world were more than just business moves. These payments had been used to cover debts accumulated from risky, illegal ventures, investments made in secret, without his wife's knowledge. The further Wang dug into Sung's past, the clearer it became that To's financial struggles had been connected to the criminal underground. Sung had been involved in a series of unsanctioned real estate deals, many of them linked to laundering money from illegal activities. To, in his pursuit of expanding his real estate empire, had unknowingly become entangled in this world. It appeared that To had been planning to reveal these dealings to his wife, and possibly to the authorities, which could have resulted in the collapse of his entire empire. This new layer of the investigation began to unravel everything Wang had previously believed. It was no longer a simple case of a business dispute or a jealous partner. It was about a man who had dug himself so deep into debt, a man who had been forced to navigate the dangerous waters of illegal business dealings in order to maintain his image. To's involvement with Sung and his dealings with loan sharks had made him a target, someone who could be disposed of in order to protect the secrecy of those involved. As Wang connected the dots, he began to suspect that Tan Mei Li's involvement in the murder was deeper than he had initially believed. She had known about To's debts, and she had certainly been aware of his relationship with Sung. While she had publicly claimed to be unaware of To's financial troubles, the evidence suggested otherwise. Tan Mei Li had been living in the lap of luxury, and despite her apparent calm during the interviews, Wang now saw that her facade was a carefully crafted act. The payments she had made to Sung indicated that she had been complicit in covering up her husband's criminal activity. Perhaps out of fear, perhaps out of greed, or perhaps out of both. But the more Wang thought about it, the more questions arose. Why would she want to kill her husband, if they were merely trying to cover up a financial scandal? Could she have been working with Sung in secret, or was she merely a pawn in a larger scheme? Was Tan Mei Li the mastermind behind the murder, or had she been manipulated into taking part? The more complex the investigation became, the more difficult it was to discern who was truly behind To's death. As Wang began to prepare for his next round of questioning, he was struck by an unsettling possibility. What if the murder had been a hit ordered by Ah Sung to silence To before he could expose the criminal underworld that had been financing his real estate ventures? Ah Sung had certainly had the motive. He had connections to the most dangerous elements of the gambling world, and he had everything to lose if To went public. But Wang couldn't shake the nagging feeling that there was still a piece of the puzzle missing. The investigation took a new turn when Wang discovered that Tan Meili had been in contact with Ah Sung the night before the murder. She had used a burner phone to make a series of calls to him, calls that had not been registered under her name. The timing of the calls suggested that they had been planning something, possibly coordinating an action. However, despite this suspicious behavior, Wang could not find definitive proof of her direct involvement in the murder. It seemed as though Ah Sung had been the one pulling the strings, using Tan Meili as a pawn in a deadly game. Wang's breakthrough came when he interviewed one of Ah Sung's associates, a low-level gangster who had been involved in the real estate ventures with To. The associate revealed that Ah Sung had been in a panic in the days leading up to To's murder. He had been worried that To was planning to cut ties with him, and he feared that To might expose their dealings to the authorities. It seemed that Ah Sung had orchestrated the murder to protect his empire of illegal business operations. But the associate also dropped another bombshell. He claimed that Tan Meili had been in the loop all along, helping Ah Sung cover up the murder and ensuring that no evidence would tie him to it. As Wang processed this new revelation, the truth finally began to reveal itself. To had been the target of a larger scheme, a scheme driven by greed, fear, and the desire to keep dangerous secrets buried. Tan Meili had not been an innocent bystander. She had been complicit in the crime, either out of fear of losing everything or out of a desire to escape a marriage that had been built on deception and financial instability. And Ah Sung, the shadowy figure in the background, had been the mastermind, orchestrating the murder to protect his criminal empire. The case was nearly closed, but Wang knew that the true complexity of To's life, and his death, was far more intricate than he had originally believed. Behind the surface of a successful businessman lay a web of deceit, illegal activities, and dangerous connections. Now, as the evidence mounted, Wang was ready to bring the perpetrators to justice. But the investigation had made one thing painfully clear. Even in the seemingly perfect lives of those we know, darkness could lurk just beneath the surface. Detective Wang spent the final days of the investigation compiling all the evidence he had gathered. As the web of lies and deceit unraveled, he found himself immersed in a case that was far more complicated than he had ever anticipated. To Sui Lung's murder was no longer just a business dispute gone wrong. It was a carefully orchestrated plot involving betrayal, manipulation, and the darkest corners of the criminal underworld. Wang's persistence had paid off. The fingerprints on the murder weapon were finally matched to Ah Sung, the notorious loan shark and criminal mastermind. With his connections to To through the underground world of real estate, Ah Sung had the most to lose if To had decided to expose the dirty dealings that had funded much of his empire. The extensive financial evidence pointed to the fact that To had been trying to pull away from these dangerous dealings, possibly trying to cleanse his reputation and protect his family. But Ah Sung, fearful of losing his grip on the illegal operations, had taken drastic measures. But the investigation didn't end with Ah Sung. Wang's suspicion of Tan Meili had been confirmed. Despite her outward composure, the evidence indicated that she had been more involved in her husband's finances than she had let on. She had been complicit in covering up To's debts, and had been in contact with Ah Sung in the days leading up to the murder. Whether driven by fear, greed, or a combination of both, she had been willing to turn a blind eye to the criminal activity her husband had been entangled in, all to maintain her luxurious lifestyle. The crucial breakthrough came when Wang discovered that Tan Meili had made several large withdrawals from a private account, funds that were later traced back to a series of payments to Ah Sung's associates. The clandestine financial transactions revealed that Tan Meili had been trying to distance herself from her husband's financial troubles, but at the same time, she was secretly ensuring that the criminal empire her husband was involved in would remain protected. Wang's final piece of evidence came from a conversation between Tan Meili and Ah Sung, which had been recorded by a discreet wiretap installed in one of Ah Sung's safe houses. In the recording, Tan Meili appeared to be negotiating a final settlement with Ah Sung. She agreed to help cover up To's murder in exchange for protection and a share of the profits from the criminal operations. It was clear that she had not only been complicit in her husband's financial entanglements, but had actively participated in his death, all in the pursuit of preserving her own wealth and position. With this last piece of evidence, Detective Wong was ready to bring both Tan Mei Li and Ah Sung to justice. On the day of the arrest, Wong couldn't help but reflect on how far the investigation had come. From the seemingly straightforward business dispute to a deadly conspiracy involving murder, money laundering, and the manipulation of trust. It was a reminder of how easily people could be drawn into a web of crime, especially when the stakes were high and the rewards seemed endless. As Wong entered the final stages of the case, he realized that while the murder of To Sui Lung had been solved, the story didn't end there. The investigation had uncovered layers of corruption and deceit, with far-reaching consequences that would affect not only those directly involved, but also the wider community. Ah Seng's arrest meant the dismantling of a dangerous criminal network, but it also meant that the lives of many innocent people would be forever changed by the fallout. In the end, Wong found little satisfaction in the resolution of the case. There was no closure in this kind of crime, only the lingering knowledge that people, when faced with desperation and greed, could make choices that would lead to tragic consequences. As he stood in the quiet office, finalizing the last of the paperwork, Wong couldn't shake the feeling that, despite bringing the perpetrators to justice, the real damage had already been done. To's murder had been the catalyst for the collapse of many lives, and though justice had been served, the scars left behind would never fully heal. For Detective Wong, it was another case closed, but one that would serve as a reminder of the destructive power of lies, betrayal, and the ruthless pursuit of wealth. Story 4. In February 2000, a chilling case of murder rocked the quiet suburb of Bukit Timah, Singapore. The victim, 32-year-old Lee Xian Wei, was a well-known figure in the local business community. As the owner of a successful technology company, Xian Wei was admired for his entrepreneurial spirit and was often described as a charismatic, ambitious man. His company, X-Tech Innovations, was at the forefront of tech development, specializing in software solutions and digital marketing tools for small businesses. However, beneath the glossy surface of his professional life, a web of personal conflicts, betrayal, and greed was slowly unraveling. Xian Wei was found dead in his luxury condominium on the 19th of February, lying in a pool of blood in the living room. The murder weapon, a sharp kitchen knife, was still embedded in his chest, and there were signs of a violent struggle. His body was discovered by his personal assistant, Siti Rama, who arrived at his apartment for a routine check-in after he had missed several scheduled meetings that day. Siti, having worked for Xian Wei for over 3 years, was visibly shaken when she called the police, her voice trembling as she reported the discovery. Detective Inspector Tan Ji Rong, a seasoned investigator with the Singapore Police Force, was assigned to the case. Upon arriving at the scene, Ji Rong immediately noted the chaotic state of the apartment. Furniture was overturned, and several of Xian Wei's personal items, including a laptop and a briefcase, had been ransacked. The apartment itself, however, was not entirely disheveled, which suggested that the murderer had been looking for something specific. The knife used in the murder was a kitchen knife from Xian Wei's own collection, indicating that the killer had been inside the apartment for some time and had likely used whatever was at hand during the attack. The first person Ji Rong spoke to was Siti Rama, the personal assistant. She had arrived at Xian Wei's apartment around 10 a.m. that day, after attempting to reach him several times on his mobile phone without success. Siti had no explanation for why Xian Wei had missed his meetings, as he had always been punctual and reliable in the past. When she entered the apartment, she found the door unlocked and immediately went inside, where she discovered Xian Wei's body. Her statement was consistent, and she appeared genuinely distraught, but Ji Rong knew that it was important to verify every detail. Siti, however, was clear that she had no knowledge of anyone who might have had a motive to harm her employer. As the investigation began, Ji Rong reviewed the initial findings. Xian Wei's body had been stabbed multiple times, with the most lethal blow to his chest. There were no signs of forced entry into the apartment, and nothing appeared to have been stolen. The apartment's security footage showed no sign of any suspicious visitors in the days leading up to the murder. Ji Rong knew that this pointed to the possibility that the killer was someone who had been allowed into the apartment, someone who had access to Xian Wei's private life. Ji Rong's next move was to look into Xian Wei's business dealings, which had been flourishing in the years prior to his death. He had recently secured a lucrative contract with a multinational corporation, and rumors had surfaced that he was planning to sell his company. These developments had made him a figure of interest to several individuals who had a stake in Stecca's future. One name that stood out was Alvin Tan, a 45-year-old entrepreneur and Xinway's business partner for nearly a decade. Alvin Tan had been an integral part of X-Tech Innovations, helping Xinway expand the company and navigate the competitive world of tech development. The two men had known each other for years, and their partnership had been the cornerstone of the company's success. But as time went on, cracks began to appear in their professional relationship. Xinway's growing ambition to sell the company had caused tensions between the two. Alvin, who had poured his own wealth into the business, was opposed to the idea of selling, fearing that he would lose control over the company he had helped build. The tension between them had escalated in recent months, with the two men often disagreeing over the direction of the business. Alvin Tan had an alibi for the time of Xinway's murder. He claimed to have been at his office, working late on a new project. However, Jirong could not ignore the possibility that Alvin might have been involved, especially given the financial strain that came with the decision to sell the company. If Xinway had been planning to sell X-Tech, Alvin stood to lose not only his stake in the company, but also his reputation. A business partner who had been sidelined could have a strong motive to eliminate the individual who threatened his livelihood. Jirong also looked into Xinway's personal life. The victim had been dating a woman named Michelle Lim, a 28-year-old marketing executive at a rival tech company. Michelle had been introduced to Xinway at a networking event several months before his death, and the two had quickly developed a close relationship. However, friends of Xinway reported that Michelle had recently become more distant, often canceling plans and failing to respond to Xinway's calls and messages. It was also rumored that Michelle had been upset by Xinway's increasing focus on his business and his intention to sell the company. Was it possible that a romantic dispute had played a role in the murder? Michelle Lim was brought in for questioning. She appeared calm but nervous, fidgeting in her seat as Jirong asked about her relationship with Xinway. She admitted that things had become strained in recent weeks, but she denied any involvement in the murder. According to Michelle, she had ended the relationship just days before the murder, feeling that Xinway had become consumed by his work and his business dealings. She had not been in contact with him in the days leading up to his death, and she claimed to have no knowledge of anyone who might have wanted to harm him. Despite her denial, Jirong couldn't help but feel that there was something more to Michelle's story. He dug deeper into her background and uncovered a startling detail. Michelle had recently been in financial trouble. She had taken out a series of high-interest loans and was struggling to pay them off. Could Michelle have been involved in the murder in an attempt to inherit Xinway's wealth, or to remove him from her life for good? While the motive wasn't immediately clear, the possibility was worth exploring further. At this point, Jirong had several potential leads. Alvin Tan's motives appeared to stem from business tensions, while Michelle Lim seemed to have a personal stake in Xinway's life, albeit a more emotional one. Yet, both suspects had solid alibis, and there was no conclusive evidence linking either of them to the crime. As the investigation continued, Jirong focused his efforts on searching for a more concrete link between the suspects and the crime scene, while also examining the financial details of Xinway's business dealings to see if any other hidden motives might emerge. More intricate story. The apartment remained locked down as forensic teams continued to comb through every detail. Jirong knew that the answer to the murder was close at hand. He just had to find the missing piece of the puzzle. But as the case unfolded, it became increasingly apparent that no one involved was as innocent as they appeared, and Xinway's death was only the beginning of a much darker and more intricate story. Detective Inspector Tan Jirong's thoughts were consumed by the growing complexity of the case. Every lead seemed to branch out into new directions, and despite having several suspects, the evidence was still far too circumstantial. The pressure was mounting as the murder of Lee Xinway, a man with such an influential presence in the tech industry, demanded an answer. Jirong knew that a case like this would not only affect the lives of those involved, but could also impact the reputation of Singapore's growing business sector. With the eyes of the city on the investigation, he needed to ensure that justice was served. Alvin Tan, Xinway's business partner, remained a key figure in the investigation. Despite his alibi, which placed him in his office at the time of the murder, Jirong wasn't convinced. A person who stood to lose so much could very well have had the most to gain from eliminating Xinway. However, without a clear motive or physical evidence linking him to the scene, Alvin's involvement remained speculative at best. Ji-Rong's team continued to dig into Alvin's financials, examining the company's accounts to look for any signs of fraudulent activity, debts, or unusual transactions that could have tied him to Xian Wei's murder. What they uncovered, however, only deepened the mystery. Alvin had been struggling financially, but not in the way one would expect. His business, though profitable, had begun to show signs of strain. Much of the company's recent profits had been reinvested into untested ventures, some of which had begun to falter. Alvin was trying to expand X-Tech innovations into new areas of technology, but these moves had not been as successful as anticipated. The stress was mounting, and Alvin seemed to be in more debt than was previously known. Further investigation into Stecca's finances revealed that Xian Wei had been secretly working on a plan to sell the company to a foreign investor, something that Alvin had vehemently opposed. Xian Wei had been meeting with potential buyers, and Ji-Rong discovered emails that indicated he was planning a sale soon. Alvin had not been informed about these meetings, which only fueled suspicions. If Xian Wei had gone ahead with the sale, Alvin's stake in the company could have been drastically reduced or even eliminated entirely, depending on the terms of the sale. It was becoming increasingly clear that Alvin had everything to lose if the deal went through without his approval. But despite the mounting evidence of financial tension between the two men, there was still no hard proof that Alvin had been involved in the murder. His alibi, though shaky, was still corroborated by colleagues and security footage from his office building. It seemed that Ji-Rong was running into a brick wall with Alvin, unless something new came to light. Then, in a break in the investigation, the forensic team delivered their analysis of the crime scene. The blood spatter and the position of the body suggested a struggle, but more interestingly, there were traces of a strange substance found on the victim's hands. It appeared to be a kind of lubricant, possibly oil, though the forensic experts couldn't confirm it immediately. This discovery sent Ji-Rong down an unexpected path. The presence of the lubricant suggested that Xian Wei had been involved in some kind of physical interaction before the murder. Was this a prelude to the violence, or had someone been trying to erase evidence of a larger crime? Ji-Rong began considering other possible suspects, and the most likely person now was Michelle Lim, Xian Wei's girlfriend. Though her initial alibi seemed solid, she had become a person of interest for reasons beyond her personal connection to the victim. The forensic evidence tied her more closely to the crime scene than Ji-Rong had expected. While no physical evidence had been found on her, investigators had uncovered phone records showing multiple conversations between Michelle and Xian Wei on the day of the murder. What had they discussed? And more crucially, why had she not mentioned these calls during her initial interviews? Ji-Rong was beginning to wonder whether Michelle had been involved in the financial arrangements that Xian Wei had been making, possibly even playing a role in his plan to sell the company. Michelle was not just a bystander in Xian Wei's life. She had been intimately involved with him, and her personal financial troubles were beginning to surface as well. She had been facing mounting debts, with numerous loans taken out in her name, many of which had been hidden from Xian Wei. Was it possible that Michelle had been blackmailing Xian Wei, pressuring him into giving her money or taking out loans in her name? If Xian Wei had discovered her financial secrets, it could have sparked a violent confrontation. The lubricant found on Xian Wei's hands could have come from Michelle's car. She had a sports car that was known to have engine problems, requiring regular maintenance. Had they argued in the car before he was killed? Perhaps it was a fight that turned deadly when emotions ran high. Ji-Rong's suspicions grew, and he ordered a deeper investigation into Michelle's background, particularly her financial situation. It seemed that she had been hiding a lot more than just a simple debt issue. Michelle was called back for questioning. This time, her responses were less confident. Ji-Rong pressed her on the details of the phone conversations she had had with Xian Wei in the days leading up to his death. Her answers were vague, and she struggled to recall the specifics of their last conversations. Ji-Rong knew that people often revealed more than they intended when they were caught off guard, and Michelle's nervousness only confirmed his growing suspicion. As Michelle faltered in her answers, Ji-Rong decided to dig into her past further. He discovered that she had been previously married, though her ex-husband was no longer in the picture. However, further digging uncovered a troubling connection. Michelle's ex-husband had once worked for a company that was embroiled in a financial scandal. This connection, though tenuous, began to paint a picture of a woman who was desperate, who had been tied to a web of financial instability, and who was willing to go to extreme lengths to secure her future. In a last-ditch effort to crack the case, Jirong requested access to Xian Wei's emails and communications. He found something he hadn't expected, an email thread between Xian Wei and a private investigator. The emails suggested that Xian Wei had been suspicious of Michelle for some time, even before the murder. He had been gathering information on her financial troubles, and he had recently hired the investigator to look into her past. Was this the catalyst that led to the argument between them? Had Xian Wei discovered the truth, threatening to expose Michelle's financial deceit, which prompted her to take matters into her own hands? With this new evidence, Jirong was certain that Michelle was involved, but the question remained. Was she the one who killed Xian Wei, or was she merely an accomplice in a larger plot orchestrated by someone else? The investigation had taken a darker turn, and the truth was finally beginning to surface. But there were still many unanswered questions. Would the motive for Xian Wei's murder be rooted in Michelle's financial desperation, or had there been a more calculated conspiracy at play? As Jirong moved forward with the case, he was determined to uncover every secret that had been buried under layers of lies, betrayal, and greed. The breakthrough in the case came just as Detective Inspector Tan Jirong was starting to feel the weight of the investigation pressing down on him. As he looked deeper into the growing web of deceit surrounding Li Xian Wei's murder, the evidence began to fall into place, but the puzzle remained incomplete. Every piece seemed to fit together, but not in the way he expected. The financial ties, the hidden relationships, the lies, everything pointed to a series of choices made by different individuals who all stood to gain from Xian Wei's death, but no single person seemed to be the perfect suspect. Michelle Lim's background was certainly troubling, but it wasn't definitive. The more Jirong investigated, the more his doubt grew. Michelle's increasing nervousness during questioning could easily be attributed to the stress of the situation, and the discovery of her financial troubles was not enough to link her directly to the crime. What if she wasn't the killer? What if someone else was pulling the strings, using Michelle as a pawn in a larger scheme? It was a thought that began to haunt Jirong, especially as he pieced together the complex interactions between the key players in Xian Wei's life. It was in the midst of reviewing Xian Wei's business dealings that Jirong uncovered something that would change the course of the investigation. The sale of X-Tech Innovations, which had seemed like the key motive for Alvin Tan, now appeared to have a much deeper significance. Jirong came across a series of emails between Xian Wei and a mysterious figure, a name that had never come up in any of the previous interviews. Marcus Yeo was an individual completely outside Xian Wei's usual circle, someone who had never been publicly associated with X-Tech or the local business scene. A thorough search revealed that Marcus had been involved in a series of shady investment deals with various tech startups, and his history with Xian Wei was not as clear-cut as it had initially seemed. The emails were cryptic, but they suggested a collaboration between Xian Wei and Marcus to secure a large sum of money in exchange for the company's upcoming sale. The catch, however, was that Marcus had a vested interest in Stecca's intellectual property. He wasn't concerned with Xian Wei's business acumen or the company's future profits. He wanted access to the proprietary software that X-Tech had developed, software that was worth millions of dollars on the black market. The emails hinted at a deal gone sour. Marcus had been demanding access to the software for months, but Xian Wei had refused, determined to sell the company to legitimate investors. The negotiations with Marcus had soured, and Xian Wei had started to back out of the deal. Jirong's mind raced as he pieced together the implications of these discoveries. If Xian Wei had backed out of the deal with Marcus, it was possible that Marcus felt betrayed, his plans foiled. But what was even more troubling was that Marcus had a history of violence. Specifically, he had been linked to a string of unsolved robberies and assaults in the area, all connected to the underground tech trade. This wasn't just a business dispute. This was a matter of life and death for Marcus. If he had lost his chance to get his hands on the software, he might have been willing to do anything to take control. Jirong dug deeper into Marcus's past. What he discovered only confirmed his fears. Marcus had been involved in multiple violent altercations, and his name had come up in several investigations related to illegal tech trafficking. He had a reputation for intimidation and threats. However, despite his criminal background, Marcus had managed to keep a low profile, which made it all the more difficult for investigators to track him down. His involvement with Xian Wei had been conducted under the radar, and no one had known about the relationship until the discovery of the emails. Ji-rong needed to find Marcus quickly. He enlisted the help of his team, who began combing through every lead related to Marcus Yeo. His whereabouts were difficult to trace, but his criminal connections were extensive. It wasn't long before a tip-off led Ji-rong to a warehouse on the outskirts of the city, a place that had been linked to Marcus's activities. The warehouse was located in an industrial area, known for housing black market operations and shady dealings. Ji-rong's gut told him that this was where he would find the answers he was looking for. As Ji-rong and his team approached the warehouse, they could feel the tension rising. The search was risky, but the evidence was too compelling to ignore. The warehouse had been abandoned, with no sign of activity, but Ji-rong knew that Marcus had been here recently. Inside, he found a room filled with high-end tech equipment, everything from stolen laptops to illegal software copies. Among the scattered items was a detailed blueprint of Stecca's proprietary software, the same software that Xianwei had been so protective of. But what really stood out was a bloody shirt found in a corner of the room, hidden beneath a pile of discarded materials. Ji-rong immediately recognized the fabric. It was a shirt that Xianwei had been wearing in a photo taken a week before his murder. This was the evidence Ji-rong had been hoping for. The bloody shirt not only connected Marcus Yeo to the scene of the crime, but it also confirmed that Xianwei had likely been at this warehouse shortly before his death. Was it possible that Xianwei had tried to meet with Marcus to settle the dispute over the software, only for the situation to turn violent? The forensic team quickly took the shirt for analysis, and the results came back within hours. The blood was a match for Xianwei. It was clear that the murder had taken place in the warehouse, not at his apartment. This discovery shifted the timeline of the murder significantly, and Ji-rong began to reconstruct the sequence of events in his mind. Xianwei had been lured to the warehouse by Marcus, under the guise of negotiating a deal. Instead, what had likely happened was that Marcus had ambushed Xianwei, enraged by the failed business deal and the loss of access to the software. The struggle had led to the murder, and in a panic, Marcus had fled the scene, taking the knife from the warehouse's kitchen. Ji-rong's next step was to locate Marcus and bring him in for questioning. It took several days of surveillance, but eventually, Marcus was found in a remote apartment, hiding out and attempting to sell stolen tech equipment. The arrest was swift, and Marcus did not resist. When brought in for questioning, he remained silent at first, but when confronted with the evidence, his defiance cracked. He admitted to luring Xianwei to the warehouse, where the confrontation turned violent. However, Marcus insisted that he never intended to kill Xianwei. It had been an accident, a moment of rage when Xianwei had refused to hand over the software. The murder was not premeditated, but Marcus was still held responsible for it. As the case against Marcus Yeo built up, Ji-rong couldn't help but reflect on the tragic chain of events that had led to Xianwei's death. What had started as a simple business dispute over a sale of a company had spiraled into a violent confrontation, driven by greed and the desperation to control something valuable. In the end, Marcus had lost everything in his pursuit of wealth and power, and Xianwei had paid the ultimate price. The investigation had uncovered the brutal truth behind Xianwei's murder, but Ji-rong knew that the scars of this case would remain long after the trial was over. Marcus Yeo's arrest brought some measure of closure, but the cost of ambition, betrayal, and violence was a lesson that no one involved would ever forget. The trial of Marcus Yeo began a few months after his arrest, and it quickly became the talk of the town. Media outlets covered the proceedings in great detail, with each new revelation adding another layer to the complex and tragic story of Lee Xianwei's murder. The courtroom was packed with reporters, family members, and members of the business community who had once looked up to Xianwei as a leader in the tech industry. It was clear that this case had far-reaching implications, not just for the individuals involved, but for the reputation of Singapore's burgeoning tech sector. Marcus, now facing charges of first-degree murder and unlawful possession of stolen property, was represented by a high-powered defense attorney. He claimed that the murder was a result of a heated argument gone wrong, but the prosecution painted a very different picture. The evidence presented in court was damning: emails, the bloodied shirt, the stolen software, and the testimony of the forensic team who had confirmed the murder's location at the warehouse. The defense's arguments failed to hold up against the weight of the evidence. As the trial unfolded, Ji-rong sat in the back of the courtroom, quietly observing. He had spent months piecing together the details of the crime, and now he was witnessing the final act of justice for Xianwei. It was a bittersweet moment. The tech mogul's life had been tragically cut short, and the lives of those left behind had been irrevocably changed. His family, who had once celebrated his success, now had to grapple with the loss of a man who had been taken from them too soon. His business, once poised for greater heights, now stood in the shadow of scandal and violence. The defense attempted to cast doubt on the prosecution's case, suggesting that there might have been another party involved in the murder. They hinted at a potential conspiracy, even going as far as to suggest that Alvin Tan, Exine Wei's business partner, might have been complicit in orchestrating the crime. However, the defense was unable to provide any evidence to support their claims. Alvin's alibi had been solid, and there was no indication that he had been involved in any illicit activities that could have led to the murder. Despite this, the defense continued to make the case that Marcus Yeo was being unfairly scapegoated for a crime he hadn't fully intended to commit. The courtroom drama came to a head when Marcus himself took the stand in his defense. His demeanor had changed since his arrest. No longer defiant, he appeared remorseful and regretful for what had transpired. He admitted that his actions had been reckless and impulsive, but he insisted that he never planned to kill Exine Wei. According to Marcus, he had only intended to confront Exine Wei, to demand the access to the software that he believed was rightfully his. But when Exine Wei had refused to comply, Marcus's frustration had reached its boiling point. In the heat of the moment, a violent struggle ensued, and Exine Wei was fatally stabbed. "I never meant to kill him," Marcus said, his voice cracking. "I just wanted what was owed to me. But when it went too far, I didn't know what to do. I panicked." Despite his admission of guilt, Marcus's plea for mercy fell on deaf ears. The jury deliberated for only a few hours before returning with a verdict. Marcus Yeo was found guilty of first-degree murder and sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. The verdict was met with mixed reactions. Some in the business community expressed sympathy for Marcus, seeing him as a victim of his own greed and desperation. Others, particularly Exine Wei's family, were satisfied with the verdict, believing that justice had finally been served. As Marcus was escorted out of the courtroom in handcuffs, Jerome couldn't help but feel a sense of closure. The case was over, but the questions lingered. What had driven Marcus to such extremes? Had the lure of wealth and power truly blinded him to the consequences of his actions? And more importantly, how many others in the world of business were willing to go to such lengths to secure their success? The murder of Lee Exine Wei had exposed the darker side of ambition, revealing just how far some individuals were willing to go for control and wealth. It had been a tragedy that shook the foundations of the tech industry, but it also served as a stark reminder of the cost of unchecked greed. Exine Wei's vision for X-Tech innovations had been one of progress, collaboration, and innovation. His death left behind a legacy tainted by violence and betrayal, but it also sparked a conversation about the importance of ethics in business and the price of ambition. In the months following the trial, X-Tech Innovations was sold to a different investor, one who promised to preserve the company's vision while moving away from the toxic environment that had led to its founder's death. Alvin Tan, though initially shaken by the events, stepped into a new role within the company, but it was clear that he would never fully escape the shadow of the murder that had so closely intertwined his future with Exine Wei's. As for Jerome, the case was a reminder of the complexity of human nature and the sometimes tragic consequences of unchecked ambition. He had solved the case, but the question remained: how many other stories like Exine Wei's were out there, hidden beneath the surface of the polished business world? The detective continued his work, knowing that every case was a step toward uncovering the truth, no matter how dark or difficult it might be. Story 5. In the cold, gray morning hours of February 15, 2000, the peaceful town of Fairfax, Virginia, was shaken by an event that would stun the local community for years to come. The body of 45-year-old Nancy Gorman was discovered in her home, her life extinguished by a brutal attack. Nancy was a respected local high school teacher, known for her commitment to her students and her quiet, unassuming life. She lived alone in a modest house on the outskirts of town, a far cry from the bustling suburban areas closer to the city center. But that morning, her life was violently interrupted in a way no one could have anticipated. Nancy had been found by her younger sister, Ellen, who had grown concerned after failing to reach her by phone. Ellen had lived nearby, and their relationship was close, so it was unusual for Nancy to be out of touch for long periods. When she arrived at the house, she immediately knew something was wrong. The door was ajar, and inside, she found Nancy lying face down in the living room, blood pooling around her body. There were signs of a violent struggle. Furniture overturned, personal belongings scattered across the floor. It was clear that the scene was one of chaos and desperation, but there was no sign of forced entry, which immediately raised questions for the responding officers. The initial examination by the responding police officers suggested that Nancy had been bludgeoned to death with a blunt instrument. The weapon was never found, but the injuries on Nancy's head were consistent with a heavy object being used to strike her repeatedly. Despite the violence of the crime, there was no indication of a robbery. Her purse and wallet were left untouched, and her car was parked in the driveway, undisturbed. This led investigators to believe that the motive for the murder was personal, rather than a random act of violence. Detective Jack Reynolds, a seasoned investigator with the Fairfax County Police Department, was assigned to the case. He quickly arrived at the scene, his mind already racing through the possibilities. Reynolds was no stranger to homicides, but this case felt different. Nancy Gorman's life had been so ordinary, so seemingly unremarkable, that it was hard to fathom what could have led someone to end it so violently. As he surveyed the crime scene, Reynolds made a mental note of the small details that might provide a clue. The position of the body, the overturned furniture, the bloodstains on the carpet that hinted at a struggle near the doorway. Reynolds instructed his team to canvass the neighborhood, speaking with anyone who might have seen anything unusual in the days leading up to the murder. The neighbors were tight-lipped, as often happens in small communities, and many claimed they hadn't seen anything out of the ordinary. One neighbor, a middle-aged man named Thomas, mentioned that he had seen a car parked in front of Nancy's house the night before, but he hadn't thought much of it at the time. The car was unfamiliar, but he didn't get a good look at it. This bit of information was the first real lead Reynolds had, but it wasn't much to go on. Still, he instructed his team to investigate the car, hoping that it might provide a breakthrough. As Reynolds dug deeper into Nancy's life, he discovered that she had few close friends. She was a quiet woman, devoted to her work as a history teacher at Fairfax High School, where she had taught for over 15 years. Her colleagues described her as dedicated and reserved, but she had no known enemies, at least not any that stood out. The people who knew her best, her family, her friends, and even her students, couldn't provide any insight into who might want to harm her. This only made the case more perplexing. The autopsy results confirmed what the initial examination had suggested. Nancy had been struck multiple times in the head, and the blows had been delivered with such force that they had caused severe trauma. The coroner also noted that there were signs of defensive wounds on Nancy's arms and hands, indicating that she had fought back against her attacker. However, there was no sign of sexual assault, and again, nothing appeared to have been stolen. Whoever had killed Nancy had likely been after something else, something far more personal than material gain. Detective Reynolds knew he had to focus on Nancy's personal life to find a motive. He requested access to her phone records, hoping to find some clue that might point him in the right direction. What he discovered shocked him. Over the past few months, Nancy had been receiving a series of disturbing phone calls. They were harassing in nature, with the caller often hanging up before she could speak. At first, Nancy hadn't reported the calls to anyone, thinking they were just the work of an annoying telemarketer or prankster. But as the calls continued, she became more concerned. Her friends and family hadn't known about them, and Nancy had never mentioned them to anyone. It was clear that whoever was behind the calls had been targeting her for some time. The phone records didn't provide much more than the fact that the calls had been made from various payphones around the area, making it difficult to track the caller. However, Reynolds was able to identify one number that had appeared more frequently than the others, a number that had been used repeatedly over the last 2 weeks before Nancy's murder. The number belonged to a man named Kevin Matthews, a former student of Nancy's who had graduated from Fairfax High School several years earlier. This revelation sent shockwaves through the investigation. Kevin Matthews had been a bright but troubled student, one who had been known to struggle with authority and discipline. He had dropped out of college and returned to Fairfax, where he had been working odd jobs in the area. His relationship with Nancy had been distant, but there had been reports of tension between the two when he was in high school. Kevin had been one of those students who had frequently clashed with Nancy during class discussions, particularly when it came to her strong stance on historical events and the way she taught her curriculum. Although they hadn't had any significant confrontations, it was enough for Reynolds to wonder if there had been something more behind Kevin's actions. Reynolds immediately ordered a search of Kevin's apartment, hoping to find any connection between him and Nancy that might shed light on his possible motive. When the team arrived, they found Kevin at home, but he appeared nervous and defensive. He denied any involvement in Nancy's murder, but his behavior seemed suspicious. During the search, investigators found several notebooks filled with angry rants and disturbing writings, many of which seemed to be directed at Nancy. In one of the notebooks, Kevin had written about a sense of betrayal and resentment toward her, claiming that she had ruined his life by treating him unfairly in school. The entries grew increasingly erratic and unsettling as they continued. When questioned, Kevin admitted to the harassing phone calls. He claimed that they were meant to get Nancy's attention, to make her acknowledge the way she had treated him years ago. He had believed that she still held some kind of grudge against him, even though there was no evidence to suggest that Nancy had ever singled him out. He explained that he had become obsessed with Nancy after a chance meeting with her in the town several months earlier. In that brief encounter, Nancy had seemed dismissive and cold toward him, which Kevin had interpreted as a rejection. It was clear now that Kevin's fixation on Nancy had turned into something much darker. However, Kevin denied any involvement in Nancy's murder. He claimed that he had not been to her house on the night of the crime, and his alibi seemed to hold up. There were no signs that he had been at the scene, and no physical evidence tied him directly to the murder. Yet, the evidence against him was mounting. His emotional instability, his past interactions with Nancy, and the disturbing writings found in his apartment painted a disturbing picture of a man who had spiraled into obsession and anger. The investigation had reached a critical juncture, and Reynolds knew that the answers were within his grasp. With Kevin Matthews emerging as the primary suspect, the question remained, was he capable of the brutality that had taken Nancy's life? And if so, what had pushed him over the edge? Detective Reynolds was cautious as he continued to investigate Kevin Matthews. He had seen many cases of obsession and fixation, but this one seemed different. There was something unsettling about Kevin's behavior and his complete lack of remorse or guilt. When questioned again, Kevin remained adamant that he had not killed Nancy. His demeanor was calm, even passive, but there was an underlying tension that Reynolds couldn't shake. The more Reynolds dug into Kevin's history, the more he began to piece together a picture of a man spiraling deeper into his own distorted world. Kevin had been a loner for much of his life. Growing up in Fairfax, he had never fit in with the other kids. He was quiet, withdrawn, and often the target of bullying. His grades had been average, but his relationship with teachers was strained, especially with Nancy. She had always been firm with him, demanding higher standards in his work and behavior. Kevin had taken this as a personal attack, a reflection of his own inadequacies. He began to harbor resentment toward her, seeing her as a symbol of the obstacles he couldn't overcome. He was convinced that she thought he would amount to nothing, just like the other adults in his life. This resentment festered over the years. Kevin had never been able to shake the feeling that Nancy had singled him out, even though there was no concrete evidence of any bias on her part. His failure to succeed academically only worsened his perception of her. After dropping out of college, Kevin returned to Fairfax and took on odd jobs, menial work that he loathed but felt trapped in. He spent his days wandering through the town, often revisiting places from his youth, including the high school where Nancy had taught for so long. These visits, initially casual, eventually became more frequent and obsessive. He would pass by the school, hoping to catch a glimpse of Nancy, but each encounter only fueled his frustration. In the months leading up to Nancy's death, Kevin's obsession with her had intensified. He would sit outside her house for hours, watching her through the windows, trying to understand her life from a distance. There was no logical explanation for why he fixated on Nancy in such a way. To him, she represented everything he had failed to become: a successful, respected figure in the community, someone he felt he had never received proper recognition from. He had tried to reach out to her in small, subtle ways. The phone calls, which had started innocently enough, were his attempt to break the silence and make Nancy aware of his presence. But as the calls continued, they became more aggressive. Kevin wanted her to acknowledge him, to apologize for what he believed had been her unfair treatment of him. Detective Reynolds had a team of officers go through Kevin's phone records again, hoping to find something that could tie him directly to the murder. There was a troubling discovery. On the night of February 14th, the day before Nancy was found dead, Kevin had placed several phone calls to her house. The calls had been made between 9 o'clock and 11 p.m., around the time Nancy would have been home alone. The frequency of the calls and the timing were too coincidental to ignore. It was clear that Kevin had been in the area, and Reynolds now had the evidence to suggest that Kevin was more involved in Nancy's death than he had initially admitted. Still, Reynolds wasn't ready to make any assumptions. He needed to understand what had happened that night. He asked his team to speak with the neighbors again, hoping to uncover any additional details. One neighbor, a woman named Margaret, revealed something that had been missed during the initial canvassing. She had heard a loud argument coming from Nancy's house that evening, followed by a series of rapid knocks on the door. Margaret hadn't thought much of it at the time, but now recalled the noise clearly. The sounds had been unmistakable, a heated confrontation, followed by a desperate pounding. But when Margaret had peeked through her window, she saw no one. The street outside was quiet. Margaret had assumed that Nancy was dealing with some sort of personal matter, but in hindsight, it seemed likely that she had been in the middle of a violent struggle. Reynolds felt a knot tighten in his stomach. The pieces of the puzzle were beginning to fit together in a chilling way. It appeared that Kevin had gone to Nancy's house that night, expecting her to finally listen to him, to recognize his anger and pain. But when Nancy had refused to engage with him, likely seeing the danger in his erratic behavior, things had escalated. The argument had turned violent, and Kevin had resorted to his overwhelming rage. He had struck Nancy repeatedly, perhaps in a fit of frustration, until she had collapsed on the floor. In the heat of the moment, he had panicked, unsure of what to do next. But he had been consumed by a need for control, to make Nancy suffer in the way he believed he had suffered under her cold, critical gaze. Kevin's lack of remorse was what struck Reynolds most. He had expected a suspect to show some sign of guilt or emotional conflict, but Kevin seemed eerily calm. When questioned about the fight, Kevin simply shrugged, as if he were recounting a mundane event, not a brutal murder. His flat tone, devoid of any real emotion, suggested a deeper detachment, a lack of empathy that only confirmed Reynolds' suspicions. Kevin had not only killed Nancy, but he had done so without a second thought, driven by a personal vendetta that had been building for years. Reynolds ordered a second round of questioning for Kevin, this time with a more aggressive approach. The detectives laid out the evidence they had gathered, Kevin's phone calls, the witness testimony, and the disturbing writings found in his apartment. They pressed him about the fight, urging him to confess to the murder. Kevin remained silent for a long time, his eyes shifting nervously from one detective to the other. Finally he broke, his voice barely audible. "It was supposed to be just a conversation," Kevin muttered. "I just wanted her to hear me, to understand. But then it all went wrong. I didn't mean to kill her. I never meant to go that far, but the confession was too late. The damage had been done. Kevin Matthews had killed Nancy Gorman, and now the truth was out. His twisted obsession had driven him to murder, and in doing so, he had destroyed both their lives." Reynolds knew that the trial ahead would be a difficult one, but it was clear that the justice system would hold Kevin accountable for his actions. However, the question still lingered in Reynolds' mind. How many other people were walking around with grudges, quietly building rage in the shadows, waiting for an opportunity to lash out? And what could be done to prevent it before it was too late? The case was not just one of a man's obsession leading to violence. It was a reminder of the darker sides of human nature, the way unresolved emotions and unspoken resentments could fester, silently destroying lives. Nancy Gorman's tragic death would never be forgotten by those who knew her, and her murder would stand as a grim reminder of how fragile the human psyche can be when pushed to the edge. As the investigation into Kevin Matthews deepened, Detective Reynolds couldn't help but reflect on the broader implications of the case. The more he learned about Kevin, the more he realized how dangerous unchecked resentment and obsession could be. He was reminded of how often people, particularly those with histories of emotional turmoil, went unnoticed until it was too late. Kevin's quiet descent into madness had been gradual, subtle even, as he blended into the background of the community, unnoticed by those who may have been able to intervene if only they had known the warning signs. It was a haunting thought that sent a chill down Reynolds' spine. How many people like Kevin were out there, harboring bitterness that would one day explode in violence? At the same time, Reynolds couldn't help but feel a pang of sympathy for Nancy Gorman, who had unknowingly become the focal point of Kevin's twisted emotions. Nancy had never treated Kevin unfairly in any real way. She had been firm with him, yes, but she had done so out of a desire to push him to succeed, not to harm him. She had likely seen a lost young man who needed guidance, not a person who would one day become obsessed with her and ultimately take her life. The tragedy of it all was that Nancy had no idea what was brewing in Kevin's mind until it was too late. The more Reynolds thought about the murder, the more questions arose. Why had Kevin's obsession with Nancy escalated to the point of violence? Was it just a simple case of unrequited emotional rage, or was there something deeper at play, something more sinister? Could Kevin's behavior have been a result of an underlying mental health condition that had never been diagnosed or treated? The unanswered questions hung heavily in the air, and Reynolds knew that while the immediate suspect was clear, the full picture of what had happened in Nancy's home on the night of February 14th was still shrouded in mystery. In the days that followed Kevin's confession, Reynolds and his team continued to investigate the case. They examined every detail, hoping to find a final piece of the puzzle that would explain the chilling events. A breakthrough came when a forensic analysis of the crime scene revealed something odd. While the evidence strongly pointed to Kevin as the perpetrator, there were certain discrepancies that made Reynolds pause. The blood spatter analysis suggested that Nancy had been attacked in one location, most likely the living room, but there were traces of blood near the back door, as if she had attempted to flee. There was a strange impression on the carpet near the door, one that seemed to indicate someone had tried to escape through the back entrance before ultimately succumbing to their injuries. This new piece of evidence caused Reynolds to question whether Kevin had been alone during the attack. Could someone else have been involved? The possibility of another person's involvement cast doubt on the ease with which the investigation had been progressing. It was now clear that Reynolds couldn't rely solely on Kevin's confession, especially since it had been given under duress. The more Reynolds thought about it, the more he realized that Kevin's initial statement, the one in which he claimed he hadn't meant to kill Nancy, might have been more than just an attempt to downplay his actions. Could it be that Kevin had acted out of sheer rage, or had someone else been there with him, pushing him over the edge? Reynolds made the decision to look further into Kevin's relationships, not just with Nancy, but with others. He dug into Kevin's past, speaking to people who had known him at various points in his life, hoping to find any indication that there might have been another party involved. One interview stood out. A former girlfriend of Kevin's, who had known him in his late teens, described him as possessive and controlling. She mentioned that Kevin had often spoken of Nancy in a strange, almost obsessive way, though at the time, she hadn't thought much of it. Kevin had also expressed frustration with his life, feeling trapped in a dead-end job and with few prospects for his future. He had confided in her that he had always felt overlooked by people in authority, especially teachers like Nancy, who seemed to represent everything he had failed to become. Kevin's ex-girlfriend also recounted a disturbing conversation they had shortly before they broke up. Kevin had revealed that he had been planning to confront Nancy, to make her understand how he felt about their past interactions. He had mentioned, in passing, that she needed to know what it felt like to be powerless. At the time, she had brushed it off as an idle threat, but looking back, it now seemed like a chilling premonition of the violence to come. The investigation now took a darker turn. Reynolds began to consider the possibility that Kevin's fixation on Nancy was only part of a larger, more dangerous mindset. Had he been influenced by someone else, someone who had exacerbated his resentment, pushing him toward violence? Kevin had been a loner, but his interactions with people who had once been close to him painted a picture of a man who had been easily manipulated. Could there have been another individual, someone more cunning, who had pushed Kevin toward the breaking point? Reynolds decided to delve deeper into Kevin's social circle. His next lead came from an unexpected source, a fellow former student of Nancy's who had known Kevin during high school. The man, Daniel, had been a friend of Kevin's in their youth, but had drifted apart over the years. However, Daniel had stayed in contact with Kevin sporadically and had noticed a change in his friend's behavior. He recalled that Kevin had become increasingly secretive and had started associating with a group of people that Daniel found troubling. They were older individuals, people who seemed to live on the fringes of society. Daniel had even overheard a conversation between Kevin and one of these individuals about getting back at the people who had wronged him. This new revelation sent shockwaves through Reynolds' investigation. Could Kevin have been part of a group that had preyed on his vulnerabilities, encouraging his obsession and ultimately pushing him toward murder? Reynolds immediately ordered a full investigation into these individuals, hoping to uncover their role in Kevin's behavior and, possibly, in Nancy's murder. As the investigation continued, Reynolds became increasingly convinced that there was more to the story than Kevin's confession let on. He realized that the case was not just about a young man's obsession with a teacher, but about the dangerous intersection of isolation, manipulation, and unresolved emotional trauma. Kevin's actions were not an isolated incident. They were part of a broader pattern of neglect, frustration, and a search for control. This realization added layers of complexity to the case, making it even more tragic. In the end, Nancy Gorman's murder was not just the result of one man's rage. It was the culmination of years of neglect, manipulation, and emotional torment. As Reynolds worked tirelessly to piece together the full story, he couldn't help but wonder how many other cases like Nancy's were out there, hidden in the shadows, waiting to be uncovered. The pursuit of justice had taken Reynolds down a dark path, one that had made him question the very nature of human behavior. The investigation into Kevin Matthews grew more complex with each passing day. Detective Reynolds, now thoroughly immersed in the details of the case, found himself grappling with the many layers of Kevin's life that had contributed to Nancy Gorman's tragic death. What had initially appeared to be a simple case of obsession-driven violence was now shaping up to be something far more insidious, a tragic confluence of mental instability, manipulation, and the toxic effects of years of social isolation. As Reynolds began to connect the dots between Kevin's various acquaintances, particularly the troubling group of older individuals he had been associating with, the detective realized that this case was not just about one individual's obsession with a former teacher. It was about the systemic failure to recognize the subtle signs of someone slipping through the cracks. Nancy's murder was the consequence of a larger, more complex issue, one that went beyond Kevin's personal vendetta and tapped into a web of neglect, emotional distress, and the toxic environments that often breed violent tendencies in vulnerable individuals. Reynolds had a gut feeling that the group Kevin had begun associating with had played a significant role in encouraging his feelings of anger and isolation. He had heard enough from those who had known Kevin in the past to know that the young man was easily impressionable, especially during his most vulnerable moments. His tendency to latch onto people who seemed to offer him the validation and attention he craved was something that could have been exploited by the wrong individuals. These people, Reynolds surmised, were not only aware of Kevin's emotional fragility, they had likely seen an opportunity to further manipulate him for their own gain. With this new understanding, Reynolds and his team worked diligently to track down the individuals connected to Kevin. They questioned several of Kevin's acquaintances, those who had known him in the months leading up to Nancy's death, hoping to unravel the full extent of their influence. In particular, Reynolds was interested in a man named Lucas, one of the individuals who had been seen with Kevin on multiple occasions. Lucas was known to have a history of criminal behavior, having been involved in various petty crimes and running in circles that had little regard for the law. As the investigation unfolded, it became clear that Lucas was no stranger to manipulation. He had taken advantage of Kevin's insecurities, perhaps even inciting his obsession with Nancy for his own purposes. It became increasingly evident that Kevin's relationship with these individuals had played a critical role in pushing him to act on his darkest impulses. But while Reynolds was determined to investigate this group, the reality was that the case had already become something far more tragic than just a murder. It was a stark reminder of the dangers of social isolation, of how a person's emotional instability could be exacerbated by the wrong influences. Kevin Matthews had been a ticking time bomb, and Nancy Gorman's death had been the inevitable result of years of neglect, unresolved trauma, and the exacerbation of his condition by a toxic group of people. In the aftermath of Nancy's murder, Fairfax was left to pick up the pieces. Her death shocked the community, and for those who had known her, it was a painful reminder of how fragile life could be. Nancy had been a dedicated teacher, someone who had genuinely cared about her students and had worked hard to help them succeed. It was almost impossible for those who had known her to reconcile the kind, intelligent woman they had worked with and respected with the brutal manner of her death. As for Kevin, he was charged with second-degree murder after his confession, but Reynolds knew that the case was far from over. With the discovery of the group's influence, Reynolds was convinced that the prosecution would have an even stronger case to present. Still, he knew that this would not bring closure to the families or the community. The repercussions of Nancy's death would be felt for years to come. She had been a victim, not only of Kevin's obsession, but of the larger forces that had allowed her killer to slip through the cracks of society. The trial that followed was a painful and lengthy process. While Kevin Matthews pled guilty, his actions and his motivations were explored in depth. The defense attorneys tried to argue that his mental state was the primary factor, claiming that Kevin had been suffering from a condition that led him to act without fully understanding the consequences of his actions. However, the prosecution argued that Kevin's obsession had been cultivated by his own deep-seated issues, compounded by the toxic influence of the people around him. They painted a picture of a young man whose emotional state had been deteriorating for years, fueled by isolation and manipulation, culminating in a violent act that left a lasting scar on the community. As the case concluded, Kevin Matthews was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. His obsession with Nancy Gorman had destroyed his own life, as well as hers, and the lives of everyone who had known them. But the case also served as a tragic reminder that sometimes it is not just the actions of the perpetrator that need to be examined. It is the environment that allows such actions to take place. The lack of intervention, the failure to address underlying issues, and the negligence of those who could have helped had all played a role in shaping the tragic outcome. Detective Reynolds, though relieved to see justice done, couldn't shake the lingering sense of sorrow that had followed him throughout the investigation. He had seen many cases in his career, but this one felt different. It was not just about solving a crime. It was about the devastating impact that a failure to recognize the signs of emotional distress and manipulation could have on an individual and their community. In the end, while Kevin Matthews may have been the one to pull the trigger, the true tragedy lay in the unseen forces that had pushed him to that breaking point. As Fairfax began to heal, the memory of Nancy Gorman's life and the senselessness of her murder would never be forgotten. It was a painful chapter in the town's history, but it served as a reminder of the importance of compassion, intervention, and vigilance in protecting those who may be suffering in silence. Story 6. In February 2000, the small town of Bellevue, Ohio, became the scene of a tragedy that would forever alter the lives of those who lived there. The quiet, tight-knit community was shaken when a body was discovered in a rural area just outside of town. The victim, a local woman named Julie Adams, was found in a wooded area not far from her home. The discovery of her body was both alarming and mysterious, as there were no immediate signs of forced entry into her home or any obvious clues at the scene. Julie Adams, a 29-year-old schoolteacher, was known for her kindness and dedication to her work. She was well liked by her students and respected by her colleagues, but there was one thing that few knew about her: a complicated and troubling relationship with her former boyfriend, Carl Benton. Their relationship had been turbulent, and their breakup had been messy, but Julie had tried to move on. She had even started dating someone new, a man named David Keller, whom she had met a few months before the tragic incident. Despite her efforts to leave the past behind, Carl's presence loomed large in her life, and her relationship with him was far from over. The evening Julie disappeared, she had been seen leaving her school after attending a faculty meeting. She had made plans to meet with David for dinner that night, but she never arrived. Her family reported her missing the following morning, and a search was launched almost immediately. Julie's car was found in the parking lot near the school, but there was no sign of her. The police were left with very few leads. That was until they received an anonymous tip. The tipster claimed to have seen a man, matching Carl Benton's description, leaving the area where Julie's body was eventually found. The police immediately brought Carl in for questioning, and he became the prime suspect in the case. Carl was known to have a volatile temper, and his behavior toward Julie in the months following their breakup had been erratic. Neighbors and friends had reported instances of Carl showing up at Julie's house uninvited, banging on her door and yelling at her. It was clear that Carl was struggling to accept the end of their relationship, but no one had expected things to escalate to violence. When Carl was brought in for questioning, his responses were calm, almost too calm. He denied having anything to do with Julie's disappearance, but his alibi for the night of her murder was shaky at best. Carl claimed he had been at home alone that night, watching television, but his story didn't hold up when the police checked with neighbors and local businesses. No one had seen him at home, and surveillance footage from a nearby gas station showed Carl's truck driving in the direction of the area where Julie's body was found, only hours before it was discovered. The investigation quickly turned to Carl's history with Julie. The more the police dug, the more they uncovered a disturbing pattern of obsessive and controlling behavior. After their breakup, Carl had made several attempts to reconcile with Julie, but she had firmly rejected him. In his mind, she was still his, and no one else would be allowed to have her. He had shown up at her home unannounced on multiple occasions, each time demanding that she take him back, even going so far as to threaten her new boyfriend, David. The police began to wonder if Carl's refusal to let go of their relationship had driven him to violence. The police conducted a thorough search of Carl's home, where they found several unsettling items. Among the belongings in his bedroom was a stack of letters, all addressed to Julie, but none of them had been sent. They were filled with desperate pleas for her to come back to him, promises that he would change, and threats of what he would do if she refused. The letters painted a picture of a man who had become increasingly fixated on his former girlfriend, unable to accept the finality of their breakup. But it wasn't just the letters that raised alarms. The police also found a large knife hidden in Carl's closet, a knife that appeared to be stained with blood. The forensic team confirmed that the blood on the knife was Julie's. Carl Benton's connection to the murder seemed clear, but there was still one missing piece to the puzzle: motive. Why had Carl killed Julie? The answer came when police interviewed Julie's new boyfriend, David Keller. David revealed that, just days before her death, Julie had received a threatening phone call from Carl. During the call, Carl had told Julie that if he couldn't have her, no one else would. Julie had been frightened by the call, and David had urged her to contact the police. However, Julie had been reluctant to get Carl into legal trouble, fearing his reaction. She had even gone so far as to change her phone number and take steps to protect herself, but Carl had still found a way to get to her. David's account of the phone call matched the contents of the letters Carl had written to Julie. In them, Carl had explicitly stated his refusal to accept her new relationship and his belief that he had the right to control her life, even if that meant resorting to violence. Julie had tried to move on, to start fresh with David, but Carl's obsession had not only followed her, it had consumed him. The police now had a clearer picture of the events leading up to Julie's murder, and Carl Benton had become the prime suspect in a case that was far more than just a love gone wrong. Detective Sarah Mitchell, who had been leading the investigation, reviewed all the evidence and began to build the case against Carl. The circumstantial evidence was damning. Carl had the motive, the opportunity, and the means to commit the crime. He had been the last person to see Julie alive, and his obsession with her had only deepened in the months leading up to her death. The bloodstained knife found at his home was the final piece that linked him directly to the crime. Still, there was one question that lingered in Detective Mitchell's mind. What had driven Carl to murder Julie? Was it simply his obsessive love for her, or was there something more? Was Carl's mental state deteriorating, leading him to believe that he had no other option but to take her life? The answer would come, but it wouldn't be as clear-cut as anyone expected. As the investigation progressed, Detective Mitchell began to delve deeper into Carl Benton's background, trying to uncover any patterns of behavior or previous incidents that might provide insight into what had led him to murder Julie. The more Mitchell learned about Carl, the more complex the case became. Carl had grown up in a broken home, with an abusive father and a mother who was largely absent, emotionally and physically. His father had been an alcoholic, prone to violent outbursts, and Carl had grown up in an environment where aggression and manipulation were the norm. These early experiences shaped Carl into a man who was emotionally stunted and unable to form healthy, stable relationships. His relationship with Julie, which had started off as a seemingly normal romance, had turned into an unhealthy obsession over time. Carl's history of failed relationships, combined with his inability to cope with rejection, painted a disturbing picture. His ex-girlfriends had spoken to the police, each recounting similar experiences of emotional manipulation, stalking, and increasingly erratic behavior. One ex-girlfriend, Heather, described how Carl would constantly call her, even after they had broken up, showing up at her work uninvited, and once even following her home. He had always insisted that he would never let her go, and when she tried to move on with another man, Carl's behavior had escalated to the point where she had to change her phone number and file a restraining order against him. These patterns of behavior were disturbingly similar to how he had treated Julie in the months leading up to her death. What Mitchell found most chilling, however, was Carl's psychological state. It became apparent that Carl had developed an unhealthy, possessive view of love and relationships. To him, love was not about mutual respect or shared affection. It was about ownership. He believed that if someone had been in a relationship with him, they were his property, and that they could never truly belong to anyone else. This distorted perception of love led to an all-consuming jealousy that ruled his interactions with those he had been romantically involved with. When Julie decided to move on, when she found someone else, Carl's sense of ownership over her was shattered, and his anger became uncontrollable. Carl's obsession with Julie had been growing steadily over the past year. After their breakup, Carl had spent months trying to convince Julie to take him back, but each time, she had refused. Julie had told Carl that she didn't want to be with him anymore, and she had even warned him that his behavior was becoming obsessive and unhealthy. But Carl didn't take these warnings seriously. He believed that if he could just show Julie how much he loved her, she would eventually change her mind. His failure to win her back fueled his anger, and that anger began to fester. His obsession with Julie turned toxic, and he began to stalk her more aggressively. He started showing up at her home, waiting for her outside of school, and even leaving gifts at her door, all of which she rejected. Despite Julie's attempts to distance herself from him, Carl's fixation only deepened. He could not accept the reality of their separation, and his mental state began to deteriorate. It was clear that he was spiraling out of control, and by February 2000, his obsession had reached a breaking point. On the night of Julie's murder, Carl had driven to her house, as he had done so many times before, but this time, things were different. He was armed, and he had a plan. The police learned that Carl had purchased the knife found at the crime scene only days before Julie's death. His possession of a weapon suggested that he had been preparing for this moment, and it seemed likely that he had planned to confront her one last time. The night of the murder, Julie had been home alone, waiting for David Keller, her new boyfriend, who was supposed to join her for dinner. David later confirmed that Julie had been excited about their plans, and she had told him that she was looking forward to spending time together. However, when David arrived at Julie's home that evening, there was no sign of her. He found her car still parked outside, but the front door was locked, and there was no answer when he rang the doorbell. It wasn't until the following morning, when Julie's body was discovered in the woods, that anyone knew what had truly happened. The police were quick to link Carl Benton to the crime, but they needed more than just circumstantial evidence to secure a conviction. Detective Mitchell decided to interview Carl again, hoping to break through his calm exterior and uncover the truth. This time, Carl was more cooperative, though his answers were evasive and inconsistent. He maintained his innocence, claiming that he had not seen Julie since their breakup and had no idea how her body had ended up in the woods. However, his body language told a different story. Carl was visibly nervous, avoiding eye contact and fidgeting with his hands during the interview. When asked about the knife, Carl's demeanor changed. He became defensive, refusing to answer the question directly. The more the detective pressed him, the more Carl's facade began to crack. Finally, after hours of questioning, Carl broke down. He admitted to going to Julie's house that night, but he claimed that he had only intended to talk to her, to try and make her see reason. According to Carl, when Julie refused to speak with him, he became enraged. He told the police that, in a fit of anger, he grabbed the knife from his truck and attacked her. He described how Julie had tried to run, but he had chased her into the woods, where he had ultimately killed her. Carl said that he didn't mean for things to escalate the way they did. It had just happened. His lack of remorse and his attempt to justify his actions only made the crime more chilling. Despite Carl's confession, there were still unanswered questions about the precise details of the murder. Julie's body had been found several miles from her home, which raised the question of how Carl had managed to transport her without drawing attention. The police suspected that Carl had used his truck to move Julie's body, but they needed more evidence to confirm this. A search of his truck revealed traces of blood, which matched Julie's DNA. This provided the final confirmation that Carl had been responsible for her death. As Carl Benton's trial loomed, Detective Mitchell reviewed the evidence one last time. The case against Carl was strong, but it was not just his actions that haunted the detective. It was the realization that a series of warning signs had been missed, that Julie had been a victim of a dangerous obsession that had spiraled out of control. The investigation had revealed how Carl's inability to accept rejection, combined with his unstable mental state, had led to a senseless act of violence. In the end, Julie Adams had paid the ultimate price for trying to move on with her life. Carl Benton was eventually convicted of first-degree murder and sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. The community of Bellevue, which had once been a quiet, peaceful place, was forever scarred by the loss of a young woman whose only crime had been trying to escape the clutches of a man who couldn't let go. The tragedy of Julie's death served as a grim reminder of the dangers of obsessive love and the destructive power of a broken heart. As the days passed and the trial approached, the community of Bellevue struggled to come to terms with the horror that had unfolded in their midst. Julie Adams, a beloved teacher, had been taken from them in the most brutal of ways, and the town found itself trying to reconcile the person they had known with the murderer who stood accused. Carl Benton, once a seemingly ordinary man, had become a figure of fear, someone whose dark obsession had turned deadly. But the trial was more than just a quest for justice for Julie. It was an exploration into the psychological depths of a man who had shattered not only the life of his victim, but also his own. The courtroom was filled with somber faces when Carl Benton was finally brought to trial. Julie's family, along with her friends and colleagues, sat in the front row, hoping to find some sense of closure. The tension in the air was palpable, as they all waited for the chance to hear the full story behind the woman they had lost. Carl's defense team worked tirelessly to paint a picture of a man who had been emotionally disturbed, someone whose past traumas and unstable mental state had led him down a tragic path. They argued that Carl's actions, though terrible, were not premeditated, and that he had been driven to murder by a combination of heartbreak and mental illness. However, the prosecution wasn't willing to let Carl off the hook so easily. They presented a case that painted Carl as a man who had been consumed by his obsessive and possessive nature long before the murder took place. They argued that his actions were not the result of a momentary lapse in judgment, but the culmination of a long history of controlling, manipulative behavior. His fixation on Julie had been escalating for months, and he had been warned by both Julie and others that his actions were unacceptable. The prosecution made it clear that Carl Benton had been fully aware of what he was doing, and that his decision to kill Julie was not an impulsive act of passion, but the result of his inability to accept rejection and control his overwhelming desire to possess her. As the trial continued, the most chilling moments came when the jury was presented with the letters Carl had written to Julie. They were filled with a mixture of desperation, anger, and entitlement. He had told her in those letters that she belonged to him and that no one else could ever take her place. He had threatened violence if she didn't comply with his wishes, yet he had also claimed to love her more than anyone else ever could. His words revealed a mind warped by jealousy and obsession, and they painted a disturbing portrait of a man who saw love not as a partnership, but as a possession. These letters became a key piece of evidence in the prosecution's case, showing not just the depth of Carl's obsession, but also his refusal to accept the boundaries of a healthy relationship. Throughout the trial, the defense attempted to argue that Carl's mental health issues, stemming from his traumatic childhood, had played a significant role in his actions. They called expert witnesses to testify that Carl's history of abuse had left him emotionally scarred, unable to form stable relationships or understand the difference between healthy attachment and dangerous obsession. The defense claimed that Carl had never intended to kill Julie, but had become so overwhelmed by his emotions that the situation had spiraled out of control. They even suggested that his actions had been a form of temporary insanity, brought on by his inability to process the pain of rejection. But the prosecution remained steadfast, arguing that Carl's actions were the result of a carefully constructed narrative in his mind, one where he believed he had the right to decide who Julie could be with, and that he could not let go of her. They presented witness testimony from people who had known Carl, including Julie's friends, who described his increasingly erratic and obsessive behavior in the months leading up to her death. They painted a picture of a man who had been given countless chances to change, who had been told time and time again to leave Julie alone, yet refused to accept the boundaries set before him. The most heart-wrenching testimony came from Julie's family and friends. Her mother, her sister, and several of her colleagues took the stand, speaking about the woman Julie had been. They described her as kind-hearted, dedicated, and full of life, someone who had always put others before herself. They spoke of her love for her students and the joy she took in teaching. They also talked about the terror she had felt in the months before her death. Julie had been afraid of Carl. She had confided in her friends about the constant harassment, the phone calls, the unexpected visits to her home, and the threats he had made. They recalled her decision to change her phone number and to keep her distance from Carl, but it seemed that nothing she did could stop him from finding her. Julie had tried to protect herself, but in the end, it had been too late. The defense, despite their best efforts, could not dissuade the jury from seeing Carl for what he truly was, a man whose obsession had turned to violence. In the end, the jury deliberated for only a few hours before returning with a guilty verdict on all counts. Carl Benton was convicted of first-degree murder, and the judge sentenced him to life in prison without the possibility of parole. There was no room for leniency in a case that had been so clear-cut, and Carl's fate was sealed. While the verdict brought some sense of closure to Julie's family and friends, it could never bring her back. The pain of losing someone so young, so full of potential, could never be fully healed. Julie had been taken by someone who couldn't let go, whose obsession had cost him everything, including his own freedom. Her death was a tragic reminder of the dangers of unhealthy relationships, and the consequences of allowing someone's fixation to grow unchecked. Carl Benton's conviction was a small victory in the fight for justice, but it was far from the end of the story. In the years that followed, Julie's family and friends worked tirelessly to raise awareness about domestic violence and obsessive behavior, using Julie's memory as a platform to educate others about the dangers of control and manipulation in relationships. They established a foundation in her name, dedicated to helping victims of stalking and relationship violence. Though nothing could bring Julie back, her legacy lived on in the lives of those who were touched by her warmth and kindness, and in the work that continued to be done in her honor. For Detective Sarah Mitchell, the case had left an indelible mark. She had seen the damage caused by obsession and the terrible consequences of failing to recognize the signs of an unhealthy relationship. While the case was closed, the lessons learned from it would stay with her forever. In the end, Carl Benton had not only taken Julie's life, he had exposed the fragile boundaries between love and possession, between affection and obsession, and how easily one could slip into the other. The aftermath of Carl Benton's trial left the town of Bellevue in a state of shock, with many still struggling to grasp the depth of the tragedy. Julie's death had ripped a hole in the fabric of the community, and while Carl had been convicted and sentenced, the emotional scars would remain for years to come. Her friends, colleagues, and family members each carried the weight of what had happened, forever altered by the events of that fateful night. In the months following the trial, the town attempted to move forward, but the loss of Julie Adams was something they would never truly recover from. The school where Julie had taught created a scholarship in her name, offering support to students who showed a dedication to teaching and kindness, qualities that Julie had embodied in her own life. It became a bittersweet reminder of a life cut short, but also a celebration of the positive impact she had made in the world. Carl Benton's life behind bars, meanwhile, was far from easy. In prison, he was faced with the consequences of his actions, an existence that was both isolated and reflective. While he had been convicted of first-degree murder, his attempts to justify his crime and portray it as a result of emotional instability did not earn him sympathy from the other inmates. Carl had made himself a target in prison, and the man who had once been a teacher and a neighbor now found himself the subject of disdain and anger from others. Though he was incarcerated, Carl's obsession with Julie never truly disappeared. In his letters to family and friends, he continued to claim that he had acted out of love and that Julie's death was a tragic misunderstanding. As the years went on, Carl's case became an example in criminal psychology classes, a case study on obsession and the psychology of possessive love. Experts discussed the blurred lines between affection and control, and how one could quickly transform into something much darker and more dangerous. Carl Benton's story became a cautionary tale, a chilling reminder of the extreme consequences of unchecked obsession, and how emotional manipulation and a distorted sense of love could lead to devastation. For Detective Sarah Mitchell, the case had left its mark, but it also deepened her resolve. She became an advocate for victims of stalking and obsessive behavior, using her experience with Carl Benton's case to educate others on the warning signs. She worked closely with local organizations to raise awareness about domestic violence, particularly the dangers of emotional manipulation and controlling relationships. Julie Adams had not only lost her life, but her story had become a source of strength for those who were suffering in silence, offering them a voice and a reminder that they deserved better. The legacy of Julie's life, though tragically brief, continued to inspire others long after her death. Her friends and family carried her memory with them, cherishing the good times they had shared with her and keeping her spirit alive through acts of kindness and community service. They knew that while Carl Benton had stolen her life, he had not stolen her legacy. Julie Adams would never be forgotten. For the people of Bellevue, the tragedy of Julie's death served as a painful lesson, a wake-up call about the dangers of emotional abuse and obsession. They had learned the hard way that the darkness of a broken mind, fueled by jealousy and possessiveness, could have devastating consequences. And while the case of Carl Benton had reached its conclusion, the conversations it sparked about healthy relationships and emotional well-being would continue, shaping the future for those who sought to protect themselves from the dangers that lurked in the shadows of obsession. Story 7. In March of 2000, a case would unfold that would leave the quiet town of Glendale, Arizona, shaken to its core. It began with the discovery of a body in a rundown motel room on the outskirts of the city. The victim was identified as Michael Harrington, a 42-year-old businessman with no apparent enemies. The circumstances surrounding his death, however, would soon reveal a much darker story. Michael had lived in Glendale for several years, having moved from Seattle for a fresh start. A divorced man with 2 children, he had been working as a sales executive for a small tech company. His life had seemed ordinary at best, and those who knew him described him as an approachable, if somewhat reserved man. He spent his days working and his evenings at local bars, trying to escape the emptiness of his personal life. Friends said that he had been struggling since his divorce, but they never thought he would fall into the kind of situation that would lead to his death. The night of March 5, 2000, Michael had checked into the Desert Breeze Motel, a low-cost establishment frequented by travelers and locals alike. According to the motel's manager, Michael had arrived around 9 p.m., paid for a room, and seemed in a hurry. He had no luggage with him, but he did seem unusually agitated, almost as though he was expecting someone or something. The manager did not think much of it at the time. People often passed through the motel in a hurry. Little did anyone know, this would be the last time Michael Harrington was seen alive. The next morning, on March 6th, the maid assigned to clean the rooms knocked on the door to room 12. When no one answered, she entered, using the key provided by the management. What she found was nothing short of horrifying. Michael's body lay on the floor, his throat slashed with a precision that suggested the killer had planned the attack. There was little blood at the scene, an indication that the killer might have restrained Michael before the fatal strike. The room itself had been ransacked, but there was no sign of forced entry. Immediately, the Glendale Police Department was called to the scene. Detective Laura Mitchell, a seasoned investigator, was assigned to lead the case. Upon arrival, she immediately began to assess the crime scene. The lack of blood spattered around the room was puzzling, but the most striking detail was Michael's demeanor. His body was positioned as if he had been surprised or caught off guard. There were signs of a struggle near the bed, but nothing in the room indicated that a robbery had taken place. Michael's wallet, watch, and phone were all intact, suggesting that the motive was not theft. Detective Mitchell scrutinized the room further. The walls were adorned with a few basic decorations, a cheap print of a desert landscape on one side, and a small TV sitting on a dresser. On the floor beside the bed, she noticed a small, crumpled piece of paper. It looked like a note, hastily written in ink. Mitchell picked it up and examined it. The note was simple, almost cryptic in its brevity. "I'll be back. Don't leave." The handwriting appeared to be rushed, and the words sent a chill down her spine. The note seemed like a message intended for someone, possibly Michael himself. But why would the killer leave such a clue behind? And who had Michael been expecting? The investigation began in earnest, with Detective Mitchell leading a team to piece together Michael's life and any connections he might have had. The first step was to identify anyone who might have been in contact with him in the days leading up to his death. Friends, family, and colleagues were interviewed, but the results only brought up more questions. Michael had kept his personal life remarkably private, and none of his acquaintances could recall anyone who had been in frequent contact with him. It was clear that he had distanced himself from the people who had once been closest to him. After reviewing Michael's phone records, it became apparent that there was one person he had been in touch with repeatedly over the past few months, a woman named Allison Cooper. Allison was a 34-year-old divorcee who had met Michael several months prior, during a business trip to Seattle. According to friends and family, the two had struck up a fast and intense romance. They had been inseparable for a time, often speaking on the phone and meeting whenever they could. However, Michael's friends reported that the relationship had soured in the weeks before his death, with Michael becoming distant and withdrawn. He had stopped returning Allison's calls and had canceled plans they had made. Despite this, there were indications that Allison had been trying to rekindle the romance, calling him incessantly. A visit to Allison's home proved to be a crucial step in the investigation. She was initially cooperative when approached by Detective Mitchell, but her demeanor quickly became erratic. She claimed that she hadn't seen Michael in days, and seemed genuinely surprised to learn of his death. But as Mitchell pressed her, it became clear that Allison was hiding something. When asked about the note found at the crime scene, she became visibly uncomfortable and struggled to maintain eye contact. The detective also learned that Allison had a history of mental health issues, including episodes of depression and obsessive behavior. She had been known to engage in heated arguments with her ex-husband over the custody of their children, and her relationships were often tumultuous. Further investigation into Allison's background revealed a troubling pattern. She had been involved in a series of short-term relationships, each one ending in dramatic and often confrontational ways. She had also been known to stalk previous partners, showing up unannounced at their homes and repeatedly calling them despite requests to stop. Her fixation on Michael seemed to have been no different. Although they had broken up, Allison was not ready to let go. She had been calling him frequently in the days leading up to his death, hoping to reconcile. But Michael had made it clear that he wanted nothing to do with her anymore, having grown tired of her obsessive behavior. On the night of March 5th, the night of Michael's death, Allison had shown up at the Desert Breeze Motel, where she had confronted him. It was believed that they had an argument in the room, one that quickly escalated into violence. In a fit of rage, Allison had attacked Michael, slashing his throat with a knife she had brought with her. The lack of blood around the room suggested that she had taken precautions, possibly using a towel to stifle the bleeding before fleeing the scene. Afterward, she had written the note, a final plea for him not to leave, and then made her way back to her car, leaving the motel in a state of frantic distress. Detective Mitchell's team was able to locate Allison's car in the vicinity of the motel, and upon further examination, blood was found on the upholstery. DNA testing confirmed that the blood belonged to Michael Harrington. With this crucial evidence, Mitchell was able to secure an arrest warrant for Allison. The woman who had once been in love with Michael had become his killer, consumed by obsession and unable to cope with rejection. Allison Cooper was arrested and charged with first-degree murder. Her trial was a media sensation, with reporters and onlookers flooding the courthouse each day. In the end, Allison pleaded guilty to second-degree murder, admitting that she had killed Michael in a fit of rage after their argument. She expressed remorse for her actions, but the damage had already been done. The community was left to mourn the loss of a man who had been taken far too soon, and to reflect on the dangers of unhealthy relationships and obsessive behavior. Michael Harrington's death served as a tragic reminder of how love, when it becomes possessive, can lead to destruction. Detective Mitchell's pursuit of the truth about Michael Harrington's death took her deeper into the tangled web of his relationship with Allison Cooper. The more she uncovered, the more it became clear that this was not a simple case of an angry lover lashing out. Michael's life, as she soon discovered, had been marked by years of emotional struggle and isolation. He had tried to rebuild after his divorce, but it seemed that his attempts to start fresh had only brought him into a dangerous and obsessive relationship with Allison. Through interviews with his colleagues at the tech company, Mitchell learned that Michael had been a quiet and methodical worker, dedicated to his job but emotionally distant. He had not been the type to open up about his personal life, keeping his pain and struggles hidden from those around him. Despite his efforts to stay focused on work, there had been rumors that he was troubled by his past and unable to fully move on from his failed marriage. His friends said he had become increasingly withdrawn, finding solace in bars and temporary distractions, but none of them realized how deep his emotional wounds ran. One friend, Tom, remembered a conversation they had a few months prior to Michael's death. Michael had confessed to him that he was having a hard time dealing with the breakup with Allison. At the time, Michael had told Tom that he felt trapped in the relationship, even though he knew it wasn't healthy. "She's just too much," Michael had said. "She loves me, but she doesn't know when to let go." It was during this conversation that Michael had first mentioned being afraid of how Allison might react if he tried to break things off. "I think she might hurt herself if I end it," Michael had confessed. His words now seemed hauntingly prophetic, especially given the nature of Allison's reaction when he finally tried to distance himself from her. Detective Mitchell's next step was to investigate the pattern of behavior that Allison had shown in her past relationships. What she discovered was nothing short of alarming. Allison had a history of fixating on her ex-partners, to the point where she would regularly show up unannounced at their homes and workplaces. She would leave incessant phone messages, often crying and pleading for another chance. One of her ex-husbands, Robert Cooper, had reported several instances of Allison stalking him after their divorce, and had even filed a restraining order against her in the past. However, the order had been dismissed after a few months, with the judge ruling that Allison's behavior was not severe enough to warrant such a measure. Her pattern of obsession and emotional manipulation had gone unchecked for years, and Michael had unknowingly become her next victim. The more Detective Mitchell learned about Allison, the more disturbing the situation became. Allison's deep-seated need for control and validation appeared to have reached an unhealthy peak during her time with Michael. She had latched onto him with an intensity that had initially drawn him in, as he had been looking for a sense of connection after his divorce. But what had started as a passionate romance had quickly spiraled into something far darker. Friends of Michael told Detective Mitchell that he had become fearful of Allison's clinginess and unpredictability. She would often show up at his apartment uninvited, bringing flowers or gifts, hoping to rekindle their relationship. Michael had tried to set boundaries, but it seemed that every time he tried to distance himself, Allison's emotional state would deteriorate further. One of Michael's co-workers, Jane, remembered a particularly unsettling incident. She recalled that Michael had confided in her a few weeks before his death about a disturbing encounter with Allison. "She showed up at my door unannounced, crying," Michael had told Jane. "She begged me not to leave her, said she couldn't live without me. It was terrifying. I didn't know what to say." Michael had been trying to break free, but Allison's emotional manipulation had made it difficult for him to do so without feeling guilty or fearful of her reaction. This constant pressure had taken a toll on him, and his decision to stay away from her in the final days of his life was likely a desperate attempt to regain control over his own existence. As Detective Mitchell pieced together the timeline of events leading to Michael's death, it became increasingly clear that the confrontation at the Desert Breeze Motel had not been a random act of violence, but the result of an escalating emotional breakdown. Allison had been trying to reconnect with Michael for weeks, but he had refused. The rejection, coupled with the emotional instability that had defined her relationship with him, pushed her to a breaking point. On the night of March 5th, she had finally confronted him, perhaps believing that this time, she could win him back or make him understand how deeply she felt for him. But when Michael had rejected her once again, something inside Allison snapped. The rage and hurt she had been carrying for months exploded in a violent outburst, leading to Michael's brutal murder. Allison's state of mind was further revealed during her subsequent interrogation. When she was brought in for questioning, she initially denied any involvement in Michael's death. She claimed that she had not seen him in days, insisting that she had been at home, trying to move on with her life. But Detective Mitchell had already gathered enough evidence to confront Allison with the truth. The blood found in her car, along with the note that had been discovered at the crime scene, were undeniable. Under the pressure of the investigation, Allison began to unravel, her story shifting as she became more defensive. Finally, she broke down and confessed to the murder. She admitted that she had gone to the motel that night, driven by a mix of jealousy, desperation, and emotional pain. When she had found Michael, he had been calm and resolute, telling her that it was over for good. The rejection, she claimed, was too much for her to bear. She described the confrontation in a matter-of-fact tone, recounting how she had picked up the knife and attacked Michael in a blind rage. She said she had never intended to kill him, but in the heat of the moment, the violence had escalated. The reality of what she had done only hit her after she had fled the scene, and she had tried to rationalize her actions, convincing herself that Michael had pushed her to it. Her confession did little to ease the pain of those who had known Michael. The evidence against her was overwhelming, and the community was left grappling with the shocking reality that a man had been killed by someone he had once loved. Michael's death was a tragic reminder of how fragile relationships could become when manipulation and obsession were allowed to grow unchecked. In the end, Allison Cooper was arrested and charged with first-degree murder. Her trial would reveal even more about the toxic dynamics of their relationship, but the damage was already done. The life of Michael Harrington, a man trying to find peace after his divorce, had been taken by someone who could not accept the end of their love. As the investigation into Michael Harrington's death progressed, Detective Mitchell found herself not only piecing together the events leading to the crime, but also uncovering the emotional and psychological damage that had been inflicted on both Michael and Allison throughout their troubled relationship. Allison Cooper, a woman consumed by obsession, had woven a complex web of manipulation and emotional control around Michael, exploiting his vulnerabilities until he had no choice but to try and escape. Allison's confession was chilling, but it did little to explain the full scope of her actions. The more Mitchell learned about her, the more it became apparent that she was not simply a woman scorned, but someone who had lived in a world of distorted emotions and unhealthy attachments for much of her adult life. Her history of tumultuous relationships and obsessive behavior had been overlooked for too long, and Michael had unknowingly walked right into the web she had carefully constructed around herself. One of the most unsettling aspects of the investigation was the extent to which Allison had been willing to go to control Michael. She had manipulated him emotionally, playing on his guilt and insecurities, pushing him into a corner where he felt as though he could not escape her. He had tried to break free, but each attempt was met with an intense emotional outpouring from Allison, crying, pleading, and threatening to harm herself if he left. Michael's friends had witnessed this pattern firsthand, and some even believed that Allison's behavior had crossed the line into manipulation and emotional abuse. But Michael had been too kind-hearted to confront her directly, and he had hoped that by simply distancing himself, she would eventually accept the situation. However, Allison could not accept it. Her feelings for Michael had become twisted, a fixation that grew stronger with every attempt he made to disengage from her. Detective Mitchell discovered that Allison had become so consumed by her desire to be with him that she had started following him without his knowledge. She had visited places where Michael frequented, showing up uninvited, hoping to find a way back into his life. Friends and co-workers remembered seeing her at his office, at local restaurants, and even at his apartment complex, always just a step behind him, always watching. What was even more unsettling was the revelation that Allison had been keeping a detailed journal of her interactions with Michael, documenting every phone call, every meeting, and every conversation. The journal entries revealed a woman who was deeply in denial about the nature of her relationship with him. She refused to see the reality of Michael's feelings, and instead convinced herself that he would eventually come back to her, as if their connection was meant to be. It was as if she had created a fantasy in her mind, one where she and Michael were always together, despite the facts to the contrary. The night of Michael's murder had been the culmination of months of mounting tension between them. As Mitchell delved deeper into the timeline of their interactions, she began to piece together the emotional escalation that led to the fatal encounter at the Desert Breeze Motel. Michael had made it clear that he wanted nothing more to do with Allison. He had stopped answering her calls, ignored her messages, and even told mutual friends that he was cutting ties with her for good. This final rejection was too much for Allison to bear. The confrontation at the motel was her last-ditch attempt to reclaim the relationship, to force Michael to acknowledge her love and to accept that he was still hers. On the night of March 5th, Allison had shown up at the motel room, hoping for a reconciliation. When Michael opened the door, he was met with an emotional and distraught Allison. Their argument began almost immediately. Michael, still resolute in his decision to end things for good, tried to explain himself, but Allison's emotional state was beyond reason. According to her confession, she had tried to make him understand that she couldn't live without him. She begged him to give her another chance, but Michael had refused. His rejection, one last time, triggered something inside Allison that she couldn't control. The confrontation turned violent quickly. In her fury, Allison had grabbed a knife from her purse, an impulsive act born of desperation. She had attacked Michael, slashing his throat with a quick, savage motion. The precise nature of the wound suggested that she had planned it beforehand, though her confession revealed that in the heat of the moment, she had acted without thinking. As Michael struggled, Allison held him down, ensuring he couldn't fight back, before making the fatal strike. The lack of blood spillage around the room only added to the horror. Allison had been careful to keep the scene contained, probably out of fear that the situation would spiral even further. Afterward, she fled the motel, leaving Michael's lifeless body behind. The emotional fallout from the crime was just as damaging to those who had known both Allison and Michael. Michael's family, especially his children, were devastated by the loss. His two children, both teenagers at the time of the murder, were left to cope with the sudden and brutal death of their father. They had known their father as a hard-working, quiet man who was always there for them, despite his personal struggles. They could not understand why anyone would want to harm him, let alone someone he had loved and trusted. Their grief was compounded by the realization that their father's death was the result of someone's overwhelming obsession, a tragic consequence of a relationship that had spiraled out of control. In the wake of the murder, Michael's friends rallied around his children, offering support and helping them navigate the difficult months ahead. The loss of their father was painful enough, but the shock of how it had happened was something that would linger with them for years. They found themselves grappling with feelings of anger, confusion, and heartbreak. The realization that someone they had known and trusted, Allison, was the cause of their father's death left them in disbelief. They couldn't comprehend how a relationship that had once seemed so promising could have devolved into such tragedy. Meanwhile, Allison's family was equally shocked by the murder. Her parents, who had always been supportive of her, struggled to reconcile the woman they had raised with the person who had killed Michael. They could not understand how their daughter, who had once been so gentle and caring, had descended into such a state of emotional chaos. Allison's mother, in particular, was devastated, blaming herself for not seeing the signs of her daughter's obsession and emotional instability. She had never imagined that the woman she had raised could commit such a heinous act, and the shame and grief weighed heavily on her. Throughout the trial, the courtroom was filled with emotional testimony from both sides. Michael's family members spoke about the pain of losing a father, while Allison's defense team tried to paint a picture of a woman driven to the brink of madness by a failed relationship. Despite the efforts to explain Allison's actions, the prosecution maintained that her actions were premeditated, that her obsession with Michael had festered over time and had ultimately led to his death. The jury deliberated for days, but the evidence against Allison was overwhelming. Finally, after weeks of legal battles, the verdict was read. Allison Cooper was convicted of second-degree murder. While her defense team had pushed for a manslaughter conviction, arguing that her actions had been driven by passion and emotional turmoil, the jury disagreed. They found that Allison had not just been a woman in emotional distress, but one who had made a conscious decision to end Michael's life. She had used the knife not in a moment of desperation, but in a calculated act of violence. The sentencing was swift. Allison was sent to prison for 25 years to life, where she would serve her time in isolation, haunted by the consequences of her obsession. For the town of Glendale, the impact of Michael Harrington's death would resonate for years. His friends and family had lost a beloved figure, someone who had been taken too soon by a woman who had refused to accept the end of a relationship. Michael's death had revealed the dangers of unhealthy emotional attachment and obsession, a lesson that would stay with those who knew him for the rest of their lives. The community, once vibrant and full of life, was left with the chilling reminder that sometimes love could turn into something far darker than anyone could imagine. As the years passed, the impact of Michael Harrington's death rippled through the lives of those who had known him. The pain of losing him never truly faded, especially for his children, who continued to struggle with the trauma of how their father had been taken from them. They often found themselves grappling with the contradictions of their grief. How could someone so close to their father, someone they had once trusted, be the cause of such a devastating loss? The memories of their father, who had always been patient and loving, were tinged with the painful knowledge of how his life had ended. Over time, Michael's children tried to rebuild their lives, but the shadow of their father's death always loomed over them. They had grown up with the belief that love was supposed to be a source of safety and security, but they now understood that love could be twisted into something harmful. The tragedy had forced them to grow up faster than they should have, and they learned to cope with their loss in different ways. His son, Jason, threw himself into his studies, determined to honor his father's memory by achieving success. His daughter, Emily, struggled with her emotions, often feeling lost in the world without the presence of her father. The murder trial had brought painful attention to the complexities of their father's relationship with Allison Cooper. The courtroom had been a spectacle, with public opinions divided over whether Allison's actions had been a result of genuine emotional distress or whether they were premeditated. The media coverage had been relentless, and both families had found themselves at the center of a storm they had never asked for. In the wake of the trial, there were attempts to rebuild, but the damage done to both families was irreparable. Allison's family, in particular, was left to deal with the consequences of her actions, struggling with feelings of shame and disbelief. They had always known Allison to be a sensitive and caring woman, but they couldn't reconcile that image with the person who had murdered Michael. For Detective Mitchell, the case had left its mark. She had solved the mystery, piecing together the details of Michael's death, but the emotional weight of the case lingered. The sense of loss and tragedy was not lost on her, and it reminded her that sometimes the darkest parts of human nature could not be easily understood or fixed. The case had forced her to confront the reality that even those closest to us, those we trust the most, can harbor destructive tendencies when driven by obsession, jealousy, and emotional turmoil. Michael's death was a stark reminder of how love, when distorted, could be deadly. In the end, the legacy of Michael Harrington's death remained a cautionary tale for those who knew him. It was a reminder that relationships, no matter how seemingly innocent, could turn toxic when emotions became overwhelming and when one party's love was left unchecked. His story became a warning to others about the dangers of obsession and the importance of knowing when to walk away from a relationship that was no longer healthy. And for those who survived him, it was a lesson in learning how to cope with loss and finding a way to move forward despite the pain. As for Allison, her future was uncertain. The prison walls that surrounded her were both a physical and emotional barrier. The woman who had once loved Michael so deeply now spent her days reflecting on her actions and the life she had destroyed. Her time in prison was marked by long periods of introspection, but the path to redemption was not clear. For her, the journey was one of confronting the depth of her obsession and coming to terms with the irreversible consequences of her choices. But no matter how much time passed, the memories of Michael Harrington, a man who had once sought peace and happiness, would never fade for those who had loved him. He would always be remembered as someone who had tried to rebuild his life, only to be taken too soon by the destructive forces of love gone wrong. His death would forever serve as a reminder that the darkest tragedies often arise from the most unexpected places. Story 8. On February 15, 2000, the small town of Buckley, Washington, was shaken by a brutal murder that would capture the attention of the entire community. The victim, a 42-year-old father named Patrick Johnson, was found dead in his home under suspicious circumstances. Patrick, a quiet and reserved man who worked as a mechanic, had lived in Buckley for most of his life. He was well known around town for his kind heart and hard-working nature. He had a small circle of close friends, a daughter, and was well liked by his neighbors. Yet, behind the facade of a peaceful suburban life, Patrick had been living through a silent storm, a storm that would ultimately take his life in a way no one could have foreseen. The investigation began when Patrick's daughter, 16-year-old Lily Johnson, called 911 after returning home from school to find her father's body lying in the living room. She immediately recognized something was wrong. Patrick was supposed to pick her up from school, but he never arrived. When she entered their modest home, she found the door slightly ajar. Stepping inside, she was hit with an overwhelming sense of unease. Her father's lifeless body was sprawled on the floor, a pool of blood surrounding him, with signs of blunt force trauma to his head. The scene was both chilling and chaotic, as if a violent struggle had taken place. Lily, in a state of panic and shock, quickly dialed 911. When the police arrived at the scene, they were met with a grim sight. Patrick's body showed clear signs of a violent altercation. His skull had been fractured, and there were defensive wounds on his hands, suggesting that he had fought for his life before succumbing to his injuries. It was clear to the investigators that Patrick had been the victim of a violent attack, but the question remained: who had done this and why? Detective Erica Harlan, a seasoned investigator with the Pierce County Sheriff's Department, was assigned to the case. She arrived at the crime scene shortly after the initial response team had secured the area. Upon entering the house, she immediately noticed the signs of forced entry. There was broken glass near the front door, as if someone had either kicked or smashed their way inside. However, nothing seemed to have been stolen, which suggested that the motive for the crime might not have been robbery. The first few hours of the investigation were spent carefully examining the crime scene. Harlan noticed the disarray in the living room, indicating a struggle had taken place. Patrick's body lay near a coffee table, and the surrounding area had been upturned, as if the attacker and the victim had moved around in a frantic attempt to overpower one another. Despite the violence of the scene, there was no immediate evidence pointing to a specific suspect. The house had been locked from the inside, and there were no obvious signs of a break-in beyond the damaged door. Harlan began to look for answers in the victim's personal life, wondering if the key to understanding his death might lie there. Lily, who had been taken to a neighbor's house after discovering the body, was understandably shaken. Harlan decided to speak with her privately to learn more about her father's life, hoping to find any clues that might lead to the identity of the killer. Lily explained that her father had been going through a rough patch in the months leading up to his death. Patrick had recently separated from his wife, Karen Johnson, after years of marital difficulties. According to Lily, the separation had been amicable, but it had still taken a toll on her father. Patrick had been struggling with feelings of loneliness and depression, something Lily had noticed more intensely in the past few weeks. He often seemed distant and withdrawn, though he tried to maintain a sense of normalcy for her sake. Lily also mentioned that her father had recently started seeing a woman named Valerie, someone he had met through a mutual friend. Valerie was described as charming and lively, and she had quickly become a regular presence in Patrick's life. Lily had grown fond of her father's new girlfriend, and the two had spent a lot of time together. Patrick seemed happier when Valerie was around, but Lily had noticed that the relationship was not without its complications. On more than one occasion, Lily had overheard heated arguments between the two, with Valerie raising her voice at Patrick in a way that seemed uncharacteristic of the kind and loving man Lily knew her father to be. She didn't think much of it at the time, but in hindsight, she wondered if there had been more going on in their relationship than she had realized. As Detective Harlan continued to ask questions, Lily's account of the weeks leading up to her father's death became a crucial piece of the puzzle. Harlan began to suspect that Patrick's relationship with Valerie might have been more tumultuous than it appeared. In a town like Buckley, everyone knew everyone else's business, and it wasn't long before the detective began to hear whispers about Valerie's past. People described her as temperamental, someone with a quick temper and a history of volatile relationships. Harlan learned that Valerie had been married twice before, and that both marriages had ended badly, with allegations of emotional and physical abuse on both sides. She was no stranger to conflict, and her behavior was beginning to raise suspicions. Harlan decided to interview Valerie. The meeting was tense. Valerie, a woman in her early 30s, was visibly nervous and fidgety when she arrived at the police station. She was well dressed, but her eyes were red, as though she had been crying for hours. Harlan began by asking her about her relationship with Patrick. Valerie claimed that they had been happy together, that they had shared a strong connection, and that she had never intended for things to get out of hand. However, as the conversation progressed, Harlan began to notice inconsistencies in Valerie's statements. Valerie became defensive when asked about their arguments, claiming they were trivial and not worth mentioning. But her body language told a different story. She appeared uncomfortable when asked about the night of the murder, and her responses grew increasingly erratic. When Harlan pressed her further about the details of the evening, Valerie's story began to unravel. She initially claimed she had been at home alone when Patrick's murder occurred, but after further questioning, she admitted that she had gone to Patrick's house that evening. According to Valerie, she had arrived at the house around 7:30 p.m. to surprise Patrick with a home-cooked dinner. However, when she arrived, she found that the door had been locked, and there was no response when she knocked. Growing worried, she decided to leave, but claimed she had seen someone in the driveway as she was leaving. She said she didn't think much of it at the time, but that now, in hindsight, it seemed suspicious. Harlan's instincts told her that Valerie was hiding something. Her alibi didn't quite add up, and the detective's gut told her that Valerie knew more than she was letting on. The investigation was far from over, but Harlan felt she was beginning to connect the dots. The next step was to search Valerie's home for any evidence that could link her to the crime scene. With a search warrant in hand, Harlan began to dig deeper into Valerie's past, hoping that the truth would eventually come to light. Little did she know, the secrets Valerie had kept hidden would soon be exposed, revealing a much darker side to her than anyone had expected. The truth was about to surface. Patrick Johnson's murder was not just the result of a heated argument, but the tragic outcome of a deeply disturbed relationship between a man who had been too trusting and a woman whose emotions had spiraled out of control. Detective Harlan's suspicion that Valerie had something to hide only deepened as she continued her investigation. The more she delved into Valerie's past, the more disturbing the pattern of volatile relationships and unstable behavior became. Interviews with Valerie's former partners revealed a woman with a history of manipulation and explosive outbursts. One of her ex-husbands, Mark Delaney, spoke candidly about the emotional abuse he had suffered during their marriage. Mark had described Valerie as charming at first, but he soon realized that beneath her friendly exterior lay a deeply controlling and possessive nature. He explained how, over time, Valerie had grown increasingly paranoid and jealous, often accusing him of infidelity without any basis for her accusations. According to Mark, Valerie's outbursts could be sudden and violent. He recalled several instances when she had physically assaulted him in fits of rage, once even throwing a glass at his head during an argument. The relationship ended after Mark sought a restraining order against her, but Valerie's aggressive tendencies didn't stop there. Her second marriage to a man named Tom Richardson ended similarly, with allegations of verbal and emotional abuse. Tom had been hesitant to speak with the police, but he eventually admitted that Valerie had threatened him several times before they split. He had even gone so far as to change his phone number and move to a different city to escape her obsessive behavior. However, like Mark, Tom had been unaware of the extent of Valerie's past until the investigation into Patrick's death began to unfold. Harlan also learned that Valerie had lived in several cities over the years, always leaving after a relationship or friendship had soured. In every town she had lived in, Valerie's presence was marked by whispers of failed relationships, and people spoke of her as someone who could not let go of the past. Those who had been close to her described her as someone who could be warm and affectionate, but only on her terms. As soon as her expectations were not met, she would lash out. It became increasingly clear to Detective Harlan that Valerie's relationship with Patrick Johnson was not as simple as it had first appeared. The pieces of the puzzle started falling into place when forensic investigators uncovered additional evidence at Patrick's home. Among the items found at the crime scene was a broken necklace, which had been lodged under Patrick's body. The necklace, a simple silver chain with a small pendant, appeared to have been torn off in the midst of the struggle. It was later confirmed through forensic analysis that the necklace had belonged to Valerie. When Harlan presented Valerie with this evidence, the woman's reaction was telling. At first, she denied that the necklace was hers, but when confronted with the forensic report, her demeanor shifted. She seemed momentarily flustered before admitting that it was indeed hers, but she claimed that she had lost it some time ago and had never seen it since. The detective pressed her further, asking why the necklace had been found at the scene of the crime, where it had clearly been involved in a struggle. Valerie grew defensive, claiming that she had no idea how it ended up there. She insisted that she hadn't been at Patrick's house on the night of the murder, but the detective wasn't buying it. Valerie's story had become increasingly inconsistent, and the evidence was pointing to her as the prime suspect. Despite her denials, the forensic evidence suggested otherwise. The presence of her necklace at the crime scene was just the latest in a series of damning clues. Meanwhile, Lily Johnson, Patrick's daughter, continued to struggle with the reality of her father's death. Though she had been instrumental in providing initial information to the police, she couldn't fully comprehend what had happened. She had a difficult time reconciling the woman she had once seen as a friend, Valerie, with the possibility that she had played a role in her father's murder. Valerie had been someone Lily had trusted, and the idea that she might have been responsible for her father's death was almost too much to bear. The emotional turmoil Lily experienced during this time was evident, as she frequently broke down during her interviews with the police. Lily, however, was resolute in her determination to see justice done for her father. She began recalling moments from the past few months that had once seemed insignificant, but now seemed crucial to the investigation. She remembered the times when Valerie had behaved possessively and jealously, particularly when Patrick spent time with other people. There had been arguments, but Lily had never thought much of them at the time. As the investigation progressed, she realized that Valerie's behavior had been a precursor to the tragedy that ultimately befell her family. It wasn't long before Harlan's suspicions were confirmed. After speaking with several neighbors, the detective learned that Valerie had been seen leaving Patrick's house the night of the murder. A neighbor who lived across the street had witnessed Valerie's car parked in front of the house late in the evening. The witness had seen Valerie walking briskly down the driveway and getting into her car, but what struck them as odd was the way she seemed to hurry away, her face expressionless, almost as if she was trying to avoid being seen. This new piece of information was the breakthrough Harlan needed. Valerie had been lying about her whereabouts, and her attempt to cover up her involvement was unraveling. Detective Harlan's next move was to confront Valerie once again, this time with all of the evidence that had been gathered against her. Valerie's story was quickly falling apart under the weight of the facts. When Harlan revealed that a witness had placed her at the scene of the crime, and that her necklace had been found near the body, Valerie's composure finally cracked. She broke down, admitting that she had gone to Patrick's house that night, but she claimed it was not to harm him. She insisted that she had simply gone to confront him about their rocky relationship, which had been deteriorating in recent weeks. Valerie tearfully explained that she had been feeling rejected and abandoned by Patrick, and she had hoped that a confrontation might resolve the issues between them. According to Valerie, their argument had escalated. She had been overwhelmed by a surge of anger and jealousy, and in the heat of the moment, she had struck Patrick with a heavy object she had found in the living room. She couldn't explain exactly what had happened next, but the rage had taken over, and before she knew it, Patrick had fallen to the floor lifeless. Valerie, in a panic, had tried to cover her tracks. She had left the house, discarded her necklace in the process, and concocted a false alibi, hoping that no one would ever find out the truth. In the end, Valerie Cooper was arrested and charged with the murder of Patrick Johnson. Her arrest sent shockwaves through the community, and many were left grappling with the realization that the woman they had once trusted could be capable of such violence. The trial would be long and contentious, but the evidence was clear. Valerie's crime was the result of emotional instability, unchecked jealousy, and a history of destructive relationships. The case became a reminder to the people of Buckley that even the most seemingly innocent relationships could be hiding dark and dangerous truths. The memory of Patrick Johnson lived on in the hearts of his friends and family, But for those who had known Valerie, the tragedy of that night would forever serve as a cautionary tale about the destructive power of love turned violent. Detective Harlan continued to meticulously build her case against Valerie Cooper. As more evidence emerged, it became clear that Valerie had attempted to cover up her involvement in Patrick Johnson's murder, manipulating the facts and using her charm to try and avoid suspicion. However, with the increasing number of witnesses and the mounting forensic evidence, Valerie's lies began to unravel. Forensic experts had examined the scene of the crime in great detail, and the findings were telling. Blood spatter patterns on the walls, furniture, and floor revealed the violent nature of the struggle that had taken place. The pathologist's report confirmed that the cause of death was blunt force trauma to the head, with multiple blows inflicted on Patrick before he lost consciousness. The trauma was consistent with an object that Valerie had most likely used in a fit of rage. Among the items found at the scene was a broken lamp, which forensic analysis showed had been the murder weapon. The lamp was a gift from Patrick's daughter, Lily, given to her father only a few months earlier. It was not an object that would have been considered a typical item to use in a fight, but it was close at hand in the living room when the altercation occurred. The lamp's heavy base had been shattered in the scuffle, and bloodstains were found on the metal frame, further tying Valerie to the scene. Harlan could already see the gravity of the evidence. Everything pointed to Valerie, but her cooperation was key to cementing the case. Lily, in the weeks following her father's death, had been struggling to cope with the emotional aftermath. She had been the one to discover his body, and the trauma from that moment stayed with her throughout the investigation. Her memories of her father were bittersweet, filled with the love and warmth he had given her throughout her life, and the growing realization that the woman she had once welcomed into their home had ultimately betrayed them. For Lily, the hardest part was facing the truth that Valerie, someone she had trusted and had come to think of as a friend, had been the one responsible for her father's death. As Harlan continued her investigation, she sought out more details about Valerie's past. It became apparent that Valerie's relationship with Patrick had been a pattern of toxic behavior that had begun long before that fateful night. Her history of failed marriages and abusive behavior had set the stage for the emotional and physical turmoil that eventually led to Patrick's death. Valerie had grown increasingly possessive and controlling, unable to let go of her insecurities, and these feelings of inadequacy were likely what triggered the violent confrontation. While Patrick had tried to remain calm and rational, hoping that the relationship would improve with time, it was clear that Valerie had not been able to manage her emotions in a healthy way. Detective Harlan also interviewed several of Patrick's friends and colleagues who had known him for years. They confirmed what Lily had told the police about the tension between Patrick and Valerie. They recalled that while Patrick seemed genuinely happy when he first started dating Valerie, things had begun to deteriorate over time. He had become more distant, as if he were retreating into himself. Friends observed that he was often on edge when Valerie was around, and his demeanor had changed. He was more anxious, more withdrawn, and increasingly unhappy. These subtle but crucial changes were signs of someone trapped in a controlling and unhealthy relationship, and they shed new light on the circumstances that led to his murder. As Harlan pieced together the events of that night, she discovered that the confrontation between Patrick and Valerie had been far from a spontaneous outburst. In fact, Valerie had been planning to confront Patrick for several days before the murder. She had been stewing over feelings of jealousy and abandonment, feeling that Patrick was pulling away from her. It was evident from the statements of friends and neighbors that she had become obsessed with controlling every aspect of Patrick's life. This obsession, combined with her emotional instability, had led to a volatile mix that ended in murder. During the trial, Valerie's defense team attempted to argue that the murder had been the result of a momentary loss of control, but the prosecution presented a strong case that demonstrated Valerie's premeditation and deliberate actions. The broken lamp, the blood evidence, and the testimonies from those who had witnessed her increasingly erratic behavior painted a portrait of a woman who had intentionally escalated the situation to a point of no return. Valerie's inability to accept rejection and her history of manipulative relationships were key factors in the prosecution's case. At trial, Lily took the stand to testify about her father's life, her memories of him, and the pain she felt after his death. Her testimony was emotional and raw, as she struggled to reconcile the woman who had once been a comforting presence in her life with the killer who had taken her father from her. Her words resonated deeply with the jury, painting a portrait of Patrick as a loving father who had been the victim of a tragic and senseless act of violence. Throughout the trial, Valerie's emotional state deteriorated. As more evidence was presented, she seemed to shrink into herself, her once confident demeanor replaced by nervous fidgeting and anxious glances. The weight of the evidence was overwhelming, and her defense team's attempts to downplay the severity of the crime fell flat. Valerie's lack of remorse became increasingly evident, further cementing the public perception that she was a woman who had allowed her rage and jealousy to destroy everything she had once held dear. Finally, after weeks of testimony and deliberation, the jury reached a verdict. Valerie Cooper was found guilty of second-degree murder. The conviction brought some closure to Patrick's family, although no verdict could ever undo the damage that had been done. Valerie was sentenced to 25 years in prison for her crime, and while the justice system had held her accountable, the emotional scars left on those who knew Patrick remained. In the aftermath of the trial, the people of Buckley were left to process the shocking truth. The murder of Patrick Johnson, a quiet and well-liked man, had been the result of a destructive and obsessive relationship that had escalated into violence. His death left behind a grieving daughter, who was left to pick up the pieces of her life in the wake of the tragedy. The case became a stark reminder of the dangers that could lurk behind seemingly ordinary relationships and the devastating consequences of unchecked emotional instability. As for Valerie, her actions had forever altered the course of her own life. The woman who had once been charming and captivating had been exposed for who she truly was, a woman driven by jealousy, insecurity, and an uncontrollable need for power and control. The once promising future she had imagined for herself was now gone, replaced by the cold reality of a prison cell and the knowledge that she would spend the rest of her life paying for the life she had taken. For Lily, the trial and its aftermath were only the beginning of a long and painful journey. While the justice system had done its part, no verdict or sentence could erase the pain of losing her father in such a brutal and senseless manner. She would carry the weight of that night with her forever, but she knew that the only way forward was to honor her father's memory and move on from the darkness that had consumed their lives. The road to healing would be long, but Lily remained determined to find peace amidst the tragedy, knowing that her father's love would never be forgotten, no matter how much time passed. As the years passed, the town of Buckley slowly returned to a sense of normalcy, but the shadow of Patrick Johnson's murder loomed over it, a constant reminder of how dark and unpredictable life could be. The case had been a turning point for many in the community, forcing them to confront uncomfortable truths about the nature of relationships and the emotional toll that unaddressed issues could inflict on those involved. In the aftermath of Valerie Cooper's conviction, Buckley seemed to have become a place more aware of the dangers of jealousy, control, and violence, issues that had previously been overlooked or brushed aside in the wake of more overt crimes. Lily, now older and more introspective, had come to terms with the fact that she could never fully escape the pain of losing her father, but she had also learned to carry his memory with pride, finding strength in the love he had given her and the life they had shared. She became an advocate for victims of domestic violence, working to raise awareness about the hidden scars that such relationships could leave behind. Though her father's death had robbed her of so much, it also inspired a deep sense of purpose within her. Through her advocacy, she was able to channel her grief into action, helping others who had been affected by the same toxic behaviors that had led to her father's tragic end. Her journey was not easy. Every time she spoke to a victim of abuse or shared her own story, she relived the pain of that fateful night. The memories of finding her father's lifeless body, the confusion, the shock, it all came rushing back in those moments. But she refused to let the darkness consume her. Instead, she focused on the positive change she could make. Each time she helped someone break free from an abusive relationship or offered support to a grieving family, she felt as though she were honoring her father's memory. She realized that healing didn't mean forgetting, but rather finding a way to move forward while still carrying the past with you. Detective Harlan, too, had been forever changed by the case. It was one of the most difficult and emotionally draining investigations she had ever worked on. There had been times when she had doubted her instincts, wondering if she was reading too much into the evidence, questioning whether she was chasing shadows. But when the truth had finally emerged, it was like a weight had been lifted from her shoulders. Valerie Cooper had been a calculated and manipulative woman, someone whose outward charm masked a violent and unstable inner world. But as much as Harlan wanted to feel vindicated by her successful investigation, she couldn't shake the feeling of sadness that lingered. The case had left her with a deep awareness of how easily lives could be shattered by someone's inability to control their emotions, and how much damage could be done when people were too afraid to speak out about their pain. Though Valerie had been convicted and sentenced, Harlan knew that the true cost of the crime couldn't be measured by any number of years behind bars. Valerie's actions had ruined so many lives, Patrick's, Lily's, and her own. Even in prison, Valerie would likely never be able to confront the depth of her own self-destructive tendencies, her inability to break free from the destructive patterns that had defined her relationships. The case would remain in Harlan's mind for years to come, a reminder that even the most seemingly straightforward investigations could reveal hidden layers of trauma and dysfunction. For Valerie, life behind bars was a far cry from the image she had once projected. No longer was she the confident, self-assured woman who had walked through the doors of Patrick's life with a smile and a carefully crafted persona. In prison, she was just another inmate, forgotten by the world she had once sought to control. Her days were filled with routine and monotony, and she spent most of her time in isolation, reflecting on the decisions that had brought her to this point. But Valerie never truly seemed to understand the gravity of her actions. Instead of taking responsibility for the devastation she had caused, she continued to justify her behavior, clinging to the notion that Patrick had deserved her anger, that her actions had been the result of betrayal and neglect. Despite her attempts to project an air of defiance, Valerie's internal world was unraveling. She would often retreat into herself, consumed by guilt, self-loathing, and an ever-present sense of isolation. The women she had once manipulated with ease were now the same women who kept her at arm's length. Valerie's reputation as a manipulative, violent woman had spread quickly within the prison, and she was forced to confront the reality that her charm and influence no longer had any power. In the end, she was left to face the consequences of a life built on lies and deceit. Patrick's memory, on the other hand, continued to live on in those who had loved him. His friends and family kept his legacy alive by supporting the causes that had been important to him, ensuring that his death was not in vain. While no one would ever forget the horrific way he had died, those who had known him remembered the good in him, the man who had been kind, loving, and devoted to his daughter. They honored his memory not just with mourning, but with actions that would help others avoid the same fate. Patrick's life, although tragically cut short, became a symbol of resilience in the face of unimaginable pain. His death had opened the door for difficult conversations about abusive relationships, and Lily's work had given a voice to those who had been silenced by fear and shame. As the years went on, Detective Harlan moved on to other cases, but the memory of Patrick's murder stayed with her. It was a case that would never fully leave her mind, a case that reminded her of the complexities of human behavior and the unpredictable paths that people's lives could take. And for Lily, the journey of healing was ongoing. The wound of her father's loss would never fully close, but with each step forward, she built something meaningful out of the tragedy. She had learned, through her work and her advocacy, that there was a way to take back some control, even in the face of the worst kind of loss. In the end, life had moved on for Buckley, but the echoes of the past still lingered, reverberating in the hearts of those who had been touched by the tragedy. They had learned hard lessons, but they had also found ways to honor the memory of those lost, and to ensure that no one would forget the consequences of unchecked jealousy, violence, and the power of manipulation. The town had been forever changed by the murder of Patrick Johnson, and while the scars would remain, the community slowly began to heal, one step at a time.